Welcome to Sleepy Dungeons. Tonight, we go back in time, far back, to a world that lived 4 million years ago, when giants walked the earth. It was a green world, full of life and mystery. The air was thick with the smell of rain and plants. Forests stretched as far as the eye could see. Rivers were wide and calm, and the sound of the wind was like music. This was the time before cities, before kings, before history itself. The earth was young and strong. Great animals ruled the land, huge beasts like the Paraceratherium, taller than a house, and the woolly mammoth, covered in thick hair that shone under the sun. Herds of early humans moved across the open plains, still learning how to live, how to think, and how to dream. The people of that time were not like us yet. They did not build machines or write books. But they watched, learned, and survived. They lived close to the land, under the same sky as the giants. When the giant beasts passed by, the ground shook softly. The people stood still, watching with wide eyes, feeling both fear and wonder. They knew that these huge animals were part of the same world, teachers of strength and patience. The forests were alive in every corner. Tall trees touched the clouds, and birds with wings like blankets flew across the sky. Lakes were deep and full of strange creatures, and nights were bright with stars that looked much closer than they do now. Everything on Earth seemed bigger, slower, and full of meaning. At this time, early humans learned the first secrets of survival. They used stones as tools. They made shelters with branches and bones. They followed herds for food and learned which fruits would heal or harm. Slowly, they began to understand the balance of life, that everything on Earth was connected. When they made their first fire, it was not only for warmth. It was also a sign of respect. They lit the fire to honor the giants who had fallen, the mammoths, the great cats, and the tall birds that had fed them and shared the land. The fire became a promise that humans would protect the earth as the giants had done before them. But time changes everything. The world began to cool. Rain became less frequent. The green forests slowly turned into dry grasslands. The giants who needed plenty of food and water started to disappear. The earth that once felt endless began to shrink, and the balance of life started to break. The early humans changed too. They learned to make better tools, to hunt together, to plan. They began to see themselves as stronger and smarter. The gentle awe they once had for the giants faded. Instead of standing beside them, humans began to compete with them. They hunted the same food, used the same rivers, and built fires where the giants once walked. Slowly, one by one, the great beasts vanished. Some say it was the cold that ended them. Others believe it was hunger, or the work of human hands. But perhaps the truth lies in both, a world that changed too quickly, and a new creature, clever and restless, taking its place. Even so, the giants never fully left. Their bones still sleep under mountains. Their shapes are carved in rocks and cliffs. And in our oldest dreams, they still walk, quiet, tall, and full of grace. The earth remembers them even when we forget. As you listen to this story, let it calm your mind. Picture the green earth as it was, wide, peaceful, alive. Hear the rustle of leaves, the deep call of the mammoth, the slow beat of the world before noise and machines. Let it take you to a place where time moves slowly, and every breath felt like part of something greater. Tonight, we will travel through that world together. We will learn how the giants rose, how humans found their place beside them, and what happened when that balance was lost. Their story is not only about the past, it is also a mirror for us today. You have already come this far into the quiet of history. Why not stay a little longer? Subscribe to Sleepy Dungeons so you never miss another journey into the lost corners of time. When giants roamed the green earth, they left behind lessons that still whisper through the wind. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them now. Long before cities, kings, and stories, there was only the earth, green, alive, and full of sound. The air was thick with mist and warmth. Rain fell almost every day, washing the land and feeding a million roots that drank deep from the soil. The world was open, endless, and kind. Rivers ran like silver veins through the land, carrying life from one place to another. Mountains stood like sleeping gods, their peaks covered in snow that melted into long valleys. Everywhere, there was green, deep forests, wide plains, and thick vines hanging from trees that touched the clouds. For a million years ago, the earth looked nothing like it does today. Most of Africa was covered in tall grass and forests where the wind moved like a voice. Giant animals lived there, peaceful but strong. There were herds of tall creatures with long necks who ate from the highest trees. Massive elephants wandered through forests that never slept. Great cats moved like shadows, silent but always watching. Birds the size of men flew low over the rivers, catching fish that sparkled in the sun. The ground itself seemed to breathe, alive with insects, frogs, and plants that stretched toward the light. The weather was gentle most of the time. Rain came in long, slow waves that fed everything, followed by days of soft sunlight. At night, the sky was wide and clear. The stars looked closer, brighter, and larger than they do now. The moon seemed to hang lower, casting silver light across the plains. The world was quiet but never silent, it hummed with the songs of living things. Even the wind had a rhythm, whispering through trees and across tall grass like a mother calming her child. In this world lived the early humans, small, clever, and curious. They were not like us, but they were our beginning. They walked upright, though still a little slow. Their faces were strong, their eyes bright. They lived in small groups, following the rivers and the animals. They built simple shelters from leaves, wood, and bones. They did not have words like ours, but they had sounds, gestures, and shared looks that carried meaning. They laughed. They feared. They loved. And every night, they sat together near the fire, watching the sky and wondering what waited beyond the trees. These people lived close to nature. They knew when the rain was coming by the smell of the air. They knew where to find food and where danger hid. They could hear the footsteps of animals from far away. They learned which fruits were safe, which roots could heal, and which rivers were clean. They learned from watching the giants. When they saw the herds move, they followed, knowing food and water would never be far behind. When they saw birds flying away from the valley, they knew a storm was coming. Nature was their teacher, and they listened well. The giants ruled the land but did not harm the small ones. The mammoths, with their long tusks, were peaceful. They walked slowly, like kings who needed no hurry. When they bathed in the rivers, they made the earth shake, but their eyes were gentle. There were also the huge horned beasts, ancestors of the rhinoceros, who grazed under the sun. They looked dangerous but cared only for grass and silence. These were the true rulers of the green earth, and yet, they shared it freely. They took only what they needed and gave balance in return. The early humans admired them. When a giant fell, old, tired, or caught by a flood, the people would gather. They did not celebrate its death. Instead, they gave thanks. They used its bones to build shelter, its skin to cover their bodies, its meat to feed their families. Nothing was wasted. And when the fire burned, they would look at the smoke rising and feel that some part of the giant was returning to the sky. That was their first belief, that life never truly ends, it only changes form. The earth during this time was warm and generous, but it could also be harsh. Sometimes the rain stopped for months, and the rivers shrank. The grass turned yellow, and food became scarce. The people moved across long distances, searching for new land. They followed the herds of mammoths and gazelles, sometimes walking for weeks without rest. Along the way, they learned to work together. They shared food, took turns watching at night, and cared for the young and the sick. This was how they survived, not by strength, but by unity. In the evenings, after travel or hunting, they would rest under trees and tell stories in simple sounds and gestures. They did not have language yet, but they had imagination. They spoke with their hands and faces, showing the shape of the animals they had seen, the rivers they had crossed, the storms that had frightened them. The children would listen wide-eyed, copying their elders' movements, learning the lessons hidden in each gesture. The stories were not just for entertainment, they were survival maps, passed from one generation to the next. The forest was full of smells, fresh leaves, wet earth, animal musk, and flowers that opened only at night. The people learned to read those smells like a book. They could tell if a predator was near, if a fruit was ripe, or if rain was coming. They lived without clocks or calendars but knew time by the color of the sky and the song of birds. The earth itself was their teacher, and every day they listened carefully. But there were dangers too. The saber-toothed cats hunted the same plains. The ground could open with sudden floods. Storms could tear down trees in moments. The people feared fire and lightning but were drawn to it. One day, perhaps by accident, lightning struck a tree near their camp. It burned for hours, glowing red and gold in the dark. The people watched, afraid to go near, but they felt warmth they had never known. Later, one brave soul picked up a burning branch and carried it close. The fire didn't harm him if he was careful. It gave light, heat, and safety. From that day on, fire became their friend. And with fire came power, the power to stay warm, to cook, to chase away beasts, and to gather in peace. The giants, too, noticed the fire. Some ran from its smell. Others stood at a distance, their eyes reflecting the flames like mirrors. It was as if the world itself understood that something had changed. The small ones had found a new secret, one that would change everything. Seasons passed. The land stayed green, but slow changes began. The air grew cooler, and dry winds started blowing from the north. The once endless forests began to thin. Grasslands replaced trees, and herds had to travel farther for food. The rivers became shallower, and lakes dried into dusty bowls. It was the first warning that the earth's balance could break. The giants struggled. Their large bodies needed much to eat, but the land no longer gave as before. The early humans, smaller and quicker, began to adapt. They learned to use stones as weapons, to store food, to dig for roots when fruits were gone. They survived through thinking, not size. The giants, once rulers of the earth, slowly grew fewer. Even so, the people remembered them. They drew their shapes on cave walls with red earth. They carved their images into bone. They told stories about them beside the fire, stories of how the giants taught them to live. In these stories, the giants were never enemies. They were teachers, reminders of how to walk gently on the land. If you could stand there now, 4 million years ago, you would see a world both strange and beautiful. The air would be thick and sweet. The sound of insects would fill the evening. You would see children laughing near rivers, chasing frogs, while in the distance, great shadows moved slowly across the grass, peaceful, majestic, unaware that their time was ending. The early humans would look up at them, not with fear, but with a quiet kind of love. Night would come slowly, wrapping everything in soft darkness. Fires would glow, voices would fade, and only the breath of the earth would remain. It was a world at peace, a moment in time when life was still learning what it meant to exist. And though the giants would one day fall, their spirit would stay forever in the land, the rivers, and in us, the children of that green earth. The days on the green earth moved slowly, one melting into the next like ripples on calm water. The people followed the sun as it crossed the sky and trusted the rhythm of nature to guide them. Seasons came and went, and each left its own memory on the land. The forests, once thick and endless, began to open. The wide plains grew larger, and the rivers curved through the earth like blue scars. The giants still roamed, but there were fewer now, and each one seemed to carry the weight of time upon its back. The early humans had begun to change too. They were no longer afraid to look the world in the eye. Their minds had grown sharper, and their hands had learned the patience of shaping things. They no longer waited for luck, they planned. They began to believe that the earth listened to them, that every sound, every gesture, every act could call something greater into being. The green earth was not just their home anymore, it was alive, breathing, and filled with unseen spirits. One evening, after a long rain, a small band of humans sat near their fire at the edge of a valley. The smoke rose slowly, twisting into the night. The stars hung low, watching. The air smelled of wet grass and wood. They were quiet, as if waiting for something. A woman, old and wise, picked up a handful of wet earth and let it fall back to the ground. "It lives," she said softly. The others nodded, though her words were not yet words, only sounds that meant truth. They all felt it. The earth lived. It could feel pain, joy, hunger, and rest, just as they did. From this feeling came the first stories. When thunder roared in the sky, they said it was the voice of the mountains calling to the sea. When the wind rushed through the forest, they said it was the breath of the giants passing unseen. When the rivers overflowed, they said the earth was crying for her lost children. Slowly, these stories became their way of understanding everything they could not explain. The world was not cold or empty to them. It was full of meaning, full of life. They began to name the things they loved. A great tree that stood at the edge of the valley became the mother tree. The river that never dried became the serpent path. The tallest mountain they could see was the sleeping giant. Each name carried respect and memory. To name something was to keep it alive, to make sure it would never be forgotten. Children grew up listening to these stories by the firelight. They learned that every sound in the forest had a reason. The croak of a frog meant the rain was near. The cry of a bird at midnight meant a storm was coming. The silence of the forest meant danger. And the glow of fireflies at dusk meant that the spirits of the giants were watching. The world spoke in signs, and the people listened. Sometimes, they would find strange shapes in the ground, the bones of the giants who had died long before. They did not know what bones were, but they felt their power. They believed the bones were gifts from the earth, reminders that strength could live on even after death. They carried small pieces of bone with them for protection. They carved simple marks into them, lines that meant safe journey or strong heart. These were the first symbols, the beginning of memory made solid. When they slept, they dreamed of the giants. In their dreams, the giants spoke. They did not use words, only feelings, warmth, light, thunder, or calm. The people woke and remembered those dreams as lessons. The mammoth told me to move east, one would say, and the tribe would follow. If the rains came and food was found, they knew the dream had been true. Slowly, the world of waking and dreaming became one. The people began to believe that their ancestors, the animals, the trees, and the rivers were all part of the same family. Each morning, before leaving their camp, they would touch the earth and whisper softly. It was their way of asking permission to walk upon it. Before hunting, they thanked the wind for carrying their scent away. When they drank from the river, they dropped a leaf into the water as a gift. These simple acts became their prayers. There were no temples, no idols, no priests, only the living world around them. The forest was their temple, the sky their roof, and the earth their altar. As generations passed, these stories grew deeper. The people began to tell of the first giant, a being made of stone and rain, who walked across the world and shaped mountains with his hands. His footprints became lakes, and his voice became the thunder. When he lay down to rest, the forests grew over him, and that is why the world was green. The children loved this story most. When the wind blew strong, they said the first giant was turning in his sleep. But not all stories were gentle. Some spoke of fire falling from the sky, of great floods that swallowed whole valleys, of dark shapes that came with the night and carried away the careless. These were warnings. The people understood that the earth could be kind, but also fierce. Balance was sacred. If they took too much or forgot to give thanks, the balance would break. This belief kept them humble. They hunted only what they needed. They shared food with the old and the weak. They never cut down more trees than they could use. To live was to respect the rhythm of the world. And still, the giants walked among them. Though fewer now, they were still the guardians of the land. The people followed their paths, watched their habits, and learned from their patience. The giants moved slowly, never rushing, never wasting. When the humans watched them, they began to copy that calm. They learned to walk quietly, to breathe softly, to move with the rhythm of nature rather than against it. The bond between them was not written in words but felt in silence. Sometimes, when a storm came, humans and giants would take shelter under the same cliffs. They would stand together, side by side, waiting for the rain to pass. In that moment, there was no fear. The giants did not harm them, they simply existed together. It was a peace that needed no promise. But change was already on its way. The air began to grow colder again, and the forests started to fade. The sky turned pale more often, and the rains came less. The green world that had once stretched forever began to shrink. The people could feel it, even if they didn't understand why. The nights were longer, the wind stronger. Sometimes they found valleys where no birds sang, where the ground cracked and plants had withered. They felt the earth's sadness, as if it too knew that something precious was slipping away. In these hard times, their stories became their shelter. Around the fire, they remembered the first giant, the mother tree, and the serpent path. They told their children, "Do not forget their names, for when we forget, they vanish." And so the names lived on, carried from one generation to the next, even as the land itself changed. Then one day, a child was born during a storm. The people said she had the voice of the wind and the strength of the river. When she grew, she was different. She was quiet but curious. She asked why the rivers dried, why the herds moved, why the stars changed their places. No one knew how to answer, so she watched the world herself. She saw how the sun moved across the sky, how shadows changed shape, and how fire always reached upward. She began to understand patterns. When she became old, she told her people, "The earth speaks in circles. Everything that goes will come again." Her name was lost long ago, but her words stayed. She was the first to see time as a circle, not a line. Her idea changed everything. The people began to look beyond the day. They planned for seasons. They saved food, shaped stronger tools, and moved before danger came. Their minds had begun to awaken in new ways. The world was still wild and green, but humanity was learning to think, to see not just what was, but what could be. And so, the green earth continued to turn. The giants still roamed, though fewer now. The people grew wiser, though smaller in spirit. The balance that had lasted for ages began to tremble. But in that trembling, something new was born: imagination, belief, and hope. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, stars shining like eyes of old gods. The fires burned low, and the wind carried the stories from one camp to another. Some of those stories would survive for thousands of generations. Even when the green earth was gone, even when the giants had turned to dust, their stories would still live, whispered through time, waiting for someone like you to listen again. As the fire dimmed, and the last spark rose into the night, the people looked to the horizon where the world slept in peace. They did not know that the greatest changes were still ahead. They only knew the earth was alive, and they were part of it. In that thought, they found comfort. The cold mornings came more often now. The mist that once hung softly over the green valleys began to feel heavier, and the rivers that once sang through the land grew quieter. Still, life went on. The people woke each day to the smell of damp grass and the cries of birds that had not yet flown away. They gathered together, lit their fires, and began to move. The world was changing, but so were they. The people had learned much from watching the earth and the giants. They knew how to follow the herds, how to find water by reading the ground, and how to make tools that could cut, dig, or defend. The first tools were simple, sharp stones, broken bones, and sticks hardened by fire. But these small things changed everything. A single shaped stone meant they could cut meat faster, dig deeper, and protect themselves when danger came. Each new idea grew from another, like roots spreading under the soil. The people no longer walked without purpose. They began to return to places they remembered, a valley where fruit grew, a stream where fish were plenty, a cave that stayed dry even in the hardest rain. Slowly, they began to make these places their own. They built circles of stones to mark where they slept. They kept piles of wood nearby for fire. They placed bones around their camp, not just for use but for memory, to remind them that others had been there before. The first signs of home began to appear. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in orange light, 2 hunters returned with something new. It was not a kill, but a discovery, a strange black stone that cracked when struck and made sharp edges. They showed it to the others. The tribe gathered, curious. They tried hitting it again, and sparks flew. At first, they stepped back, afraid. But when they saw the sparks fade harmlessly, they tried again. The stone broke cleanly, sharper than any tooth or claw. From that moment, they began to search for more of those black stones, and soon they learned to shape them into blades. The age of stone had quietly begun. With tools, life grew easier. They could cut thick hides to make clothing. They could dig for roots and carve wood into shapes that fit their hands. But more importantly, they began to share what they made. When one hunter found a good stone, he gave a piece to another. When a woman made a new way to tie vines into ropes, she showed her friends how to do it. The sharing became habit. It made them stronger. They were no longer just small families wandering alone, they were becoming something greater. They were becoming a people. They began to divide their tasks without even planning it. The strongest hunted, the patient ones gathered fruit, the careful ones made tools, and the old ones taught the young. The tribe moved like a single body, each part helping the other. When someone was hurt, they did not leave them behind. When food was found, everyone ate. In this unity, they found power. They were not as large as the giants, but together, they were mighty. The land around them was still full of danger. Wild beasts prowled at night, and storms came without warning. But now the people had fire, tools, and trust. When they built their fires in the open, it scared away predators. The glow of firelight became a wall between fear and safety. Around it, they talked, laughed, and dreamed. The sound of voices filled the night where once there had only been silence. Their language was still growing. They did not yet have words like ours, but their sounds carried meaning, short hums, clicks, and sighs that spoke of hunger, danger, joy, or love. Each generation added new sounds. Over time, the sounds became names, for people, for places, for the things they cherished. Naming something made it real in their hearts. A mountain was not just a shape, it was home. A river was not just water, it was giver of life. They did not speak much, but when they did, every sound mattered. The people began to decorate their tools and bodies. They rubbed colored earth on their skin, leaving red and brown marks like paint. They tied small bones and shells into cords and wore them around their necks. They pressed their hands against cave walls and blew pigment through hollow reeds, leaving their marks behind, handprints, animal shapes, circles. No one knew why they did it. Perhaps to remember, perhaps to be seen by the earth itself. These were the first signs that humans had begun to dream not only of survival, but of meaning. Seasons passed. The herds moved farther north. The rivers changed course. The people followed as always, but now they knew how to find their way back. They remembered the stars. They followed the moon. They could walk for weeks and still know how to return to the valley that had given them life. Their minds were no longer trapped in the moment, they had begun to hold the idea of time itself. Children grew up watching their elders shape stones and build fires. They learned to throw stones and use sticks to dig or defend. But they also learned to listen. When the night fell and the wind whispered through the trees, the elders told stories, not just of the past, but of lessons. One story told of a hunter who wasted food and was left alone when famine came. Another spoke of a woman who followed the stars and found new land when all seemed lost. Through stories, they taught wisdom. Through stories, they became human. As their minds grew, so did their understanding of the world. They began to notice patterns, that certain plants grew only after rain, that birds flew south before storms, that the moon changed shape in a steady rhythm. They started to plan around these patterns. They planted seeds near their camps, not yet farming, but learning that life could return where it was once taken. They began to store nuts and dried fruits in small pits covered with leaves. It was the first quiet step toward the idea of the future. The giants still roamed nearby. The people no longer feared them as they once had, but they still watched them with respect. When the mammoths moved, the ground still shook. When they bathed in the river, the water glowed with sunlight. The people learned to follow at a distance. They walked behind the herds, gathering what was left, broken branches, trampled fruit, and small animals stirred up by the movement of giants. The giants led, the humans followed. It was a rhythm as old as time itself. But the people had something the giants did not, memory. They began to notice the tracks the mammoths left behind and to remember where they led. They could return to the same waterhole months later, knowing it would be full. They could find safe caves from seasons before. Knowledge was becoming their power. The giants ruled the land by strength, humans would soon rule it by thought. Still, there was peace between them. Sometimes, when the fog was thick and sound carried softly, the people would hear the calls of the mammoths echoing through the valley, deep, slow, and full of sadness. They believed the giants were speaking to the earth, reminding her of promises made long ago. When the people heard that sound, they stopped and listened. They felt small, but not unimportant. They knew they belonged to the same living world. One morning, after heavy rain, the tribe found a strange valley. The soil was soft, and pools of water shimmered under the sun. In one of the pools lay a giant skull, half buried in mud, larger than any they had seen. The children touched it with wonder. The elders bowed their heads. They felt they were standing in a sacred place. They covered the skull with flowers and stones, and for days they camped nearby, lighting fires at night as if guarding its spirit. This was the first burial made not for their own kind, but for another creature. It showed love, respect, and memory, feelings that only hearts capable of dreaming could hold. Over time, these moments became part of their way of life. When something died, they gave thanks. When something was born, they sang softly. When storms passed, they watched the sky until the first ray of sun broke through. Every act had meaning. They were no longer just surviving, they were beginning to live with awareness. As years turned to generations, the people changed. Their hands grew steadier, their minds quicker, their eyes more curious. They discovered that stones could make fire if struck right, that animal fat could make light if burned in shells, that caves could echo voices like songs. They began to see beauty in things that had no purpose, the shape of a leaf, the shine of a river stone, the sound of wind in hollow wood. The first sparks of art and wonder were being born. And yet, the earth continued to shift. The cold spread slowly south. Forests gave way to open plains. The herds moved farther each year, and sometimes food was scarce. The people grew tougher, more clever. They learned to store meat in cool caves, to hunt together using traps and signs. They spoke to each other with clearer sounds. They learned the power of togetherness, that alone they were weak, but together they could stand against anything. They no longer waited for life to happen to them, they began to shape it. The green earth was still vast and full of mystery, but now the people walked upon it with purpose. They had become the thinkers of the land, the dreamers of the world. They did not yet know it, but every step they took was leading them towards something new, the rise of memory, the birth of invention, and the slow fading of the giants who had once ruled before them. And so, under a sky of fading warmth, as mammoths roamed far in the distance and smoke curled gently above the plains, the people gathered one last time around their fire. They looked into the flames, and in its glow, they saw everything they had become. The earth was still alive, still green, still filled with stories waiting to be told. But deep within, a quiet change had begun, the whisper of the first great awakening of humankind. The people had learned to survive, and in surviving, they had begun to grow. The world around them was colder now, yet their fires burned brighter. The sky had changed color, it seemed higher, thinner, and the wind was sharper when it blew across the plains. The forests had pulled back toward the mountains, leaving wide open grasslands that reached the horizon. Herds of great animals still crossed those plains, mammoths, wild horses, giant deer with golden antlers, but the herds were smaller now, and the people had to travel farther to find them. They had grown stronger in mind and body. They could hunt together, plan together, and care for one another. They had learned to dream of tomorrow. But the world was growing harder, and in every tribe, someone had to guide the rest. From the quiet order of their lives came the first leaders, not kings or rulers, but protectors, chosen by the people for their wisdom and courage. They were hunters who could track for days without rest, mothers who could calm fear with a look, and elders who could read the sky as if it were a story written just for them. There was one such man, tall and silent, with a scar that crossed his cheek. His tribe called him Doro, which meant one who listens. He was not the strongest, but he saw what others missed. He could find water even in the driest land, and when he walked, even the wild dogs did not bark. One cold season, when food grew scarce and the rivers froze, it was Doro who led his people to the Valley of Warm Stones. The valley lay hidden between two cliffs, and there, the earth breathed heat through cracks in the ground. Steam rose from small pools, and even when frost covered the grass, the soil there stayed soft. The people made camp in that valley and lived through the cold months because Doro had followed the signs, the shape of the clouds, the way birds flew, and the sound of distant water beneath the earth. When spring came, they gave thanks to the earth by painting red clay on the rocks. They drew lines that showed the mountains and circles that marked the pools. This was not only a memory, it was a way to speak to those who would come after. The story of Doro became part of their world, a story not just of survival, but of leadership born from listening. Many such leaders appeared in those times. Each tribe had its own guide, each chosen in a different way. Some were chosen by bravery, others by kindness. Some were women whose songs could calm a frightened crowd or soothe a crying child. Some were men who could stand against a wild beast and protect the weak. These were the first heroes of humankind, though they did not see themselves that way. They did what needed to be done, and their people remembered. As the tribes grew, they began to meet others. Sometimes they shared food and stories, sometimes they fought. When they met peacefully, they traded shells for stone, fire for fruit, stories for safety. But when fear ruled the meeting, anger followed. A wrong look, a harsh sound, or a hunger too strong could lead to battle. And in battle, courage found its voice. One story spoke of a woman named Asha, small and quiet, who led her tribe when the mammoths fled north. One night, another tribe came, desperate for food. They took what they could, and a fight broke out. Asha stood before her people, holding only a burning branch. The firelight glowed on her face, and she spoke softly, not shouting, not running. The others stopped, uncertain. She placed the fire between them and said, "We can share." It was the first time two tribes ate together after nearly fighting. When the night ended, both sides had food and rest. Asha's name became a song that mothers taught their daughters, a song of peace through courage. Not all heroes were gentle, and not all leaders were kind. Some learned that power could control others. As humans grew in number, their minds also grew in pride. They began to see that their words could move hearts and that fear could make others obey. This was the birth of command, a shadow that would follow humanity forever. Some leaders protected, others began to rule. The people still lived simply, but their hearts had begun to taste ambition. When tribes grew large, they needed someone to make choices for all. In one valley near the great river, several families joined together under a man called Giru, known for his loud voice and fierce eyes. Giru was brave in the hunt and clever with traps. He brought his people meat when others starved. But he also wanted more. He began to tell others where to sleep, when to move, and who could eat first. At first, they followed him willingly, for he had saved them. But slowly, his voice became the law, and fear replaced trust. One evening, an old woman stood up to him. She told the tribe, "The earth feeds all, no one owns her gifts." Giru shouted, but no one helped him. That night, he sat alone by his fire, and when morning came, he was gone. The tribe stayed together, but they remembered the lesson: a leader must guide, not rule. From that time on, when they chose their next protector, they watched not only for strength, but for heart. The giants were still part of their world. Though fewer now, their presence was a reminder of how small humans truly were. Sometimes, when a leader died, the people would leave their body near a place where mammoths passed. They believed the giants carried their spirits to the mountains where the sky touched the earth. It was said that if the wind blew gently through the valley the next morning, it meant the spirit had been welcomed. As generations passed, the stories of Doro, Asha, and Giru became lessons. They were told not just to remember the past, but to teach. Listen like Doro, parents would tell their children. Speak like Asha. Never forget Giru. These stories became the first rules, long before there were written laws. They were carried in voices and firelight, in rhythm and breath, shaping how people thought of right and wrong. Hunting also changed. With leaders to guide and thinkers to plan, the people began to create traps that worked together. They built fences of branches, dug pits, and used fire to guide animals toward them. It was dangerous work, but when they succeeded, the whole tribe rejoiced. They danced around the fire, not for victory, but for gratitude. The dance became a way to remember the hunt, who had been brave, who had fallen, and how the earth had provided once again. As their confidence grew, so did their stories of themselves. They began to believe they were not only children of the earth but chosen ones, meant to shape it. The giants were fading, and the people saw it. Some were sad, others proud. "The world is ours now," a young man once said by the river, and his words hung in the air like smoke. No one answered, but all heard. something inside them shifted. The green earth was still vast, but in their minds, they were beginning to see it as a place that could be changed, not only worshipped. The leaders began to meet between tribes. They shared paths, warned each other of floods or droughts, and exchanged gifts, shells, carved stones, colored pigments. It was the birth of friendship between distant people. Sometimes these meetings ended in fights, but sometimes they ended in laughter. From those who met in peace came the first bond between strangers, a new kind of strength that would one day build whole nations. One evening, after a great hunt, several tribes gathered on a wide plain. Fires burned across the night, hundreds of them, like stars fallen to the ground. The people shared food, danced, and told stories. A young child asked her mother, "Who is the leader of all?" The mother smiled and said, "The fire." The child frowned, confused. "Why the fire?" The mother pointed to the glow that lit every face equally. "Because it gives to all and takes from none." The child nodded slowly. It was a simple answer, but it carried truth. In that moment, humanity still belonged to the earth, not to one another, not to power, but to balance. But balance is fragile. As the gatherings grew larger, so did pride. Some tribes wanted to be remembered. They began to mark their places with tall stones and carvings, signs of where they had been. They painted hands on cliffs and animals on cave walls. The earth became their canvas, their memory, their proof of life. The first signs of human legacy had begun, the quiet declaration that they existed and wanted to be remembered. The green earth, though colder now, still held its magic. When the sun rose over the plains, it painted the world gold. The people stood watching it, silent, feeling both small and infinite. They did not know what the future would bring, but they felt its shadow. The giants were leaving, and humanity was stepping forward, uncertain but unafraid. And so the tribes moved on, following rivers and dreams, guided by leaders whose names would fade but whose spirit would remain. They walked under skies that seemed to grow wider each year. They carried stories in their voices, fire in their hands, and courage in their hearts. And though they did not yet understand it, the world they walked upon was slowly becoming theirs, not through conquest, but through care, through memory, and through the quiet rise of leadership born from love. The earth turned once more. Night settled. The fires burned low. And in the hush of the wind, the echoes of giants and heroes mixed together, reminders of a time when strength meant not ruling, but protecting. The people slept, dreaming of what lay ahead, new lands, new challenges, and new hearts brave enough to lead them through the changing green earth. The seasons had begun to shift again. The air that once smelled of fresh rain now carried a hint of dust. The people, strong and restless, felt it before they saw it. The herds that once filled the plains began to move farther away, and the rivers they had always trusted grew shallower. The green earth, once endless, was changing again, and the people had to follow. They had grown wiser through generations of walking. Their feet knew the paths even before their eyes did. They could read the ground and sky as if they were open books. When the clouds gathered in the west, they knew rain was coming. When the stars moved slightly in the night, they knew a new season had begun. They no longer wandered without aim, they traveled with purpose. They followed the rivers north in summer and returned to the valleys in winter. They had become travelers of the earth, moving not only for food but for curiosity. As they journeyed, they found new lands, valleys rich with fruit, mountains heavy with stone, and forests unlike any they had known. Some of these lands were peaceful, filled with gentle winds and clear water. Others were harsh, where the ground was cracked and dry. Yet, wherever they went, they adapted. They learned the language of each place, how its trees grew, how its animals behaved, and how its soil felt beneath their feet. Every new discovery taught them something about the world and about themselves. Sometimes, when they reached a new valley, they found signs of others. Stones arranged in circles, ashes of old fires, or drawings on rock faces. These were the marks of tribes they had never met but somehow understood. The shapes told stories of hunts, of births, of floods. Though they could not speak the same words, they shared the same heart. The earth was their common language. The first meetings between different tribes were uncertain. They approached one another slowly, hands raised, fire burning between them. At times, fear won, and they turned away. But sometimes, trust found a path. One tribe would offer meat, another would bring fruit or stone blades. Gifts became a bridge between strangers. Soon, they began to visit each other's camps. They shared stories, dances, and songs carried by the wind. The earth grew smaller in their minds, no longer a mystery to fear but a home they shared. From these meetings came trade. The people of the forest gave colored stones and resin that smelled sweet when burned. The people of the plains gave meat, skins, and bones carved into tools. Each had something the other needed. For the first time, humans built connections beyond blood and tribe. The flow of exchange, of goods, of ideas, of friendship, began to shape them. It was not conquest that spread them across the land, but cooperation. One evening, at a meeting of two tribes by a wide river, an old woman took a glowing ember from her fire and placed it in the hands of another tribe's leader. "Share the warmth," she said softly. It was a gift of trust, a promise that fire, like knowledge, was not meant to be owned. The other tribe carried that ember for days, lighting their own fires with it, believing it held the spirit of peace. That act became legend. From that night onward, when tribes met, they exchanged embers before words, a silent greeting of unity. As the people moved farther, they began to see how vast the earth truly was. Some crossed the mountains and found lands filled with snow. Others followed the great rivers to where they met the sea, a sight that filled them with both wonder and fear. The endless water moved and breathed like a living thing. They tasted it and found it bitter. They threw stones and watched them disappear into the waves. They had found the edge of the world as they knew it. Some believed it was where the sky and the earth met to rest. Others thought it was the path to the land of the spirits. Whatever it was, they bowed before it in silence. Travel changed them in more ways than one. The new lands required new ideas. They learned to build better shelters using branches, mud, and hide stretched tight to keep out wind. They made ropes from twisted vines and baskets from reeds. They began to store water in animal skins and carry fire in stone bowls. Every problem gave birth to invention, and every invention carried the mark of human patience. But even as they spread farther, they did not forget the giants. On the open plains, they still saw mammoths moving like slow clouds, their shadows long and gentle. In the forests, they still found footprints of creatures larger than any they could imagine. Some tribes followed the giants, believing they brought good luck. Others avoided them, fearing their strength. But all respected them. When a giant fell, the land seemed to mourn. The people would gather quietly, leaving flowers and stones, as if saying farewell to a guardian of the old world. There were times, however, when the old peace began to crack. The more people met, the more they desired. They saw new lands and wanted them. They saw new tools and wanted to possess them. A quiet tension grew between some tribes. They began to guard their fires, their stones, their secrets. Where once there had been open sharing, now there was caution. The earth, wide as it was, began to feel smaller again, not because of distance, but because of fear. Still, not all was lost. Many tribes found ways to keep peace. When conflict threatened, they met under a large tree or near a river, where both sides could drink from the same water. They placed stones in the middle, one from each tribe, and promised not to harm each other as long as those stones remained. In time, these places became sacred, known as the peace grounds. Even when generations passed, the people remembered where they were. Travelers passing through would stop there, add another stone, and rest without fear. The stories also grew with the journeys. New songs were born, songs of travel, of trade, of friendship found on long roads. Some sang of the stars, calling them the fires of those who walk the sky. Others sang of the rivers, saying they were the veins of the earth. These songs carry hope and memory. Even when tribes moved far apart, their songs shared the same rhythm, as if the heartbeat of the world itself kept time for them all. The children listened to these songs as they walked, watching the sky change from blue to gold to black. The elders taught them to read the land, to follow bird paths, to feel wind direction, to taste soil and know where water hid beneath it. Every step they took was a lesson, every sound a story. They learned that travel was not just movement, it was learning. And in learning, they became something more than wanderers, they became explorers. Sometimes the travelers found themselves in strange lands where the air smelled different and the stars looked unfamiliar. They wondered if the earth ended somewhere, or if it went on forever. No one knew, but that mystery did not frighten them anymore. It only made them curious. The spirit of exploration had begun, quiet, patient, unstoppable. When they returned to the valleys of their ancestors, they brought new things, stones that glittered, shells from the far sea, and stories that no one had heard before. They told of lands where the cold was so strong it turned water into stone, and of lands where the trees grew so thick the sun barely touched the ground. Their people listened in awe, eyes wide with wonder. These stories made them proud, not because they owned the world, but because they were part of it. As they spread, their knowledge spread too. The shape of tools changed. Spears became sharper, handles smoother. They learned to use fire to harden wood, to cook meat slowly over embers so it stayed good for days. They found new ways to dress animal skins so they would last longer and keep out the cold. In every new place, humans left behind signs of their learning, stones shaped by hands, bones carved with care, ashes where fire once burned. The green earth watched them, and though her face changed, she still carried them gently. She gave them challenges, but also rewards. When the rivers dried, new fruits grew. When herds vanished, fish filled the streams. When storms tore down forests, new grass sprouted after. She was testing her children, teaching them to grow strong without forgetting her rhythm. Yet, far away, on the northern plains, the giants were struggling. The cold that crept slowly year by year had begun to take its toll. The mammoths moved less, their young weaker each season. The people noticed. They followed the herds with quiet sadness, knowing they were watching the end of an age. When a mammoth fell for the last time, they did not cheer. They knelt beside it, laying their hands on its fur, whispering the old songs. The world was changing, and the giants were becoming memories. The people mourned, but they also understood. The earth had chosen them to carry the flame forward, the fire of memory, of learning, of life. The giants had ruled through strength and size, humans would rule through thought and unity. The earth had not lost her children, she had simply given them a new form. So the people continued to travel, not to conquer but to connect. They made friends, they made mistakes, and they learned from both. They built new homes in caves, on cliffs, and near rivers. They raised stones in circles, not for power, but for prayer. They sang to the stars, not for answers, but for company. The world, though colder, still breathed with them. As the fires burned low at night, the old ones would look into the flames and whisper, "We walk where the giants once walked. We live because they once lived." Their voices carried softly across the plains, mixing with the wind. Somewhere in that wind, if one listened closely, it sounded almost like the low, distant call of a mammoth, a memory that refused to die. And as dawn came, lighting the horizon in soft gold, the people stood ready once again. Their faces were stronger, their eyes clearer, their hearts full. The green earth still turned beneath their feet, and they were no longer its guests. They were its keepers. The age of movement had begun, an age that would take them beyond rivers, beyond valleys, and into the farthest corners of the world. The travelers who had once followed the rivers and winds began to stay longer in certain places. The earth had tested them through hunger and cold, but now, in many parts of the land, the seasons began to balance again. The long winters grew shorter, and gentle rain returned to the plains. The people, tired of constant movement, began to rest. They built their fires in the same valleys each year, until one day, they simply did not leave. That was how the first true homes began. They built shelters from stone, wood, and mud. The walls were thick and round to keep out wind. The roofs were layered with leaves and branches that let in the scent of rain but kept the cold away. At night, smoke rose from hundreds of small fires across the valleys, a sign that people had begun to settle. The green earth, once wide and open, now carried the footprints of those who would stay. The age of wandering was giving birth to the age of belonging. Life began to change in quiet, simple ways. The people no longer chased the herds across endless plains. Instead, they found ways to make food come to them. They began to plant seeds near their homes, noticing how new shoots grew where old fruit had fallen. They started to keep animals near their camps, small goats, dogs, and wild cattle. The world that had once ruled them was now learning to live with them. It was not control, not yet, but partnership. With food nearby, life became easier. The people had time to rest, to think, to create. They began to decorate their homes with color. They painted walls with red and black earth, drawing shapes of animals, rivers, and stars. They carved small figures from stone, mothers holding children, hunters with spears, birds in flight. These were not tools but memories made solid, ways of saying, "We were here." Each morning, the valleys came alive with sound. Children laughed near streams, women crushed seeds with stones, men repaired tools and traps. Smoke drifted lazily across the air, carrying the smell of roasted grain and meat. The earth, once silent and wild, now echoed with human life. And as the people grew more at peace, they began to look beyond survival. They began to search for beauty. They found beauty in rhythm. The sound of a stone striking another became music. They noticed that hollow wood made different tones when tapped. Someone began to hum, and another joined in. The first songs were born, soft and low, following the rhythm of daily work, grinding, carving, weaving. When night came, they sang together around the fire. Their voices rose into the sky, blending with the wind. The earth listened and seemed to hum back. The stars became part of their stories. They noticed how certain stars returned each season, how some rose when rains began and others when snow fell. They followed them not out of fear but fascination. The night sky became their first book, and each shining light was a word in a language they were slowly learning to read. When they looked up, they saw not emptiness but connection, a reflection of their own growing order on the land below. As the people grew in number, they began to build larger shelters, not just for one family, but for many. They shaped stones carefully, one on top of another, learning how weight and balance worked. Some built wide meeting circles where people could gather and talk. Others raised tall poles carved with symbols of the sun and moon. These were not fortresses or palaces, they were places of unity, built to remind everyone that life was better when shared. The leaders of this new age were different from the hunters of the past. They were builders, thinkers, and storytellers. They guided through understanding rather than command. When disputes arose, they did not fight but listened. Around the fire, decisions were made by those who spoke with calm, not those who shouted the loudest. The earth had taught them patience, and that patience now shaped their world. Trade became stronger. People traveled from one valley to another, carrying clay pots, woven baskets, and shining stones. They exchanged more than goods, they exchanged ideas. One valley learned from another how to bake clay in fire to make vessels that held water for months. Another discovered how to twist animal hair into thread and make cloth that lasted through winter. These small inventions were seeds of a greater world quietly taking root. With safety and food came time to reflect. The people began to ask questions they had never asked before about birth, death, and the stars. They no longer saw the world only through survival but through wonder. They began to imagine unseen powers, the breath of the wind, the spirit in the river, the voice in the flame. Some said the giants had not vanished but had become those forces. The mammoths had turned into mountains, the eagles into storms, the wise elders into stars. The people believed that when they died, their breath joined the wind, and their hearts returned to the soil. Life, they understood, was not an ending but a circle. When the rain came, they celebrated. They danced barefoot in the mud, their laughter mixing with the thunder. They sang to the clouds, thanking them for coming. When the harvest came, they shared food and stories. The old told the young about the world before, when they followed the herds, when the rivers were wider, when giants walked beside them. The children listened with open mouths, half believing, half dreaming. Though they had never seen the giants, they felt them in the earth beneath their feet. The valleys began to glow with art. People painted not just for memory, but for joy. They used crushed stones and ash to make colors, red for life, white for peace, black for night, and yellow for the sun. They painted animals they no longer saw, hoping to keep them alive in spirit. They carved patterns into the walls of their homes, lines that curved like rivers and spirals that reminded them of the stars. Every mark was a message that humans had learned to shape the world not only with their hands, but with their hearts. The giants were gone, but the people still felt guided by them. In dreams, they saw their shapes, slow, silent, patient. When they worked the fields, they imagined the giants walking beside them, watching with quiet pride. They spoke to them in whispers when the wind blew through the trees, thanking them for teaching the first lessons of strength and peace. And when a child was born, the mother would place her hand on the ground and say, "The earth is given again." As generations passed, the people built bigger gatherings. Some began to lay stones in perfect circles, not for shelter, but for meaning. They stood in the open fields, facing the sunrise. When light touched the stones, they believed the world was reborn. These were the first temples, not to gods of thunder or war, but to time itself, to the endless rhythm of life. The people did not pray for riches or power, they prayed for balance, for the earth to stay kind. Their art became more daring. They carved figures taller than a man, faces that looked both human and animal. They believed these were guardians, spirits that protected the valley. At night, when the firelight flickered against them, the carvings seemed alive. The children would hide behind their mothers, but the elders smiled, saying, "Do not fear what watches with love." The green earth had entered her golden age. For the first time, humanity was not just surviving, it was creating. The people had learned the secrets of fire, stone, and time. They had learned to live in peace more often than in fear. But like all golden ages, this too carried a quiet warning. With comfort came desire, and with desire came the first cracks of pride. Some began to take more grain than they needed. Some built larger homes and wanted others to work for them. Slowly, the idea of possession crept into their minds, the idea that things could belong to one person rather than to all. It happened slowly, almost gently. A man claimed a field and said it was his because he had planted the first seed there. Another claimed a spring because he had found it. Others followed. The unity that had once bound them began to stretch thin. Still, the songs continued, the fires burned, and the children laughed. The earth gave no judgment, only silence. Yet, in that silence, a new feeling began to stir, ambition. The same curiosity that once drove humans to explore now whispered of control. The same cleverness that once saved them now began to separate them. The Golden Age shone brightly, but somewhere deep in its glow, the first shadows began to form. And so the people stood between two worlds, one of balance and one of desire. They looked at their monuments and felt pride. They looked at their harvests and felt ownership. They looked at each other and, for the first time, saw not only kin but difference. The earth, patient and quiet, continued to turn. She had seen this before, the rise, the peace, and the beginning of unrest. The fires burned late into the night. The old ones told stories of how it all began, when humans and giants shared the same rhythm. The young listened but only half believed. The world of endless green and peace seemed like a dream too far away. Yet, deep in the soil beneath their feet, the memory of that old world still slept, waiting, listening, remembering. And as dawn came again, lining the stone circles and the painted walls, humanity took another step forward, not knowing that with every step toward greatness, it also walked closer to its first fall. The morning after the great fires, the world seemed peaceful again. Smoke rose softly from the valley homes, curling upward into the pale blue sky. The people went about their daily tasks, tending to crops, feeding animals, carrying water, shaping clay. The Golden Age still shone, but its light had changed. It was no longer the wild joy of discovery, it was the quiet rhythm of habit. Humanity had learned how to live well. Now, it was learning how to live together. Each valley had grown into a community. What once were small families had become whole villages, and each village had its own way of life. Some lived close to rivers, fishing and planting reeds. Others stayed in the highlands, raising goats and carving stones. Some villages were rich in clay and made pots that traveled far in trade. Others had salt or metal hidden beneath the earth, which they dug and shaped with fire. No village could survive alone anymore. They needed one another, and so the world began to weave itself together like a great web of exchange. People began to travel not only for need but for purpose. Traders walked long distances, carrying baskets filled with grain, pots, and ornaments. They followed the rivers and mountain passes, guided by landmarks they had carved long ago. When they reached another settlement, they were greeted with food and stories before trade even began. The world had grown larger, but it was also more connected than ever. The people who traded often became known and respected. They brought not only goods but also news. They told of floods far away, of new animals seen in the mountains, of villages that had grown or vanished. They carried not only what the hands could hold but what the heart could imagine. They were the first messengers, the first keepers of distant voices. Within the villages, life had become richer. The houses were stronger, built close together in circles around a central fire or meeting place. In the evenings, the villagers would gather there. The elders would tell stories, the women would sing, and the children would dance in the dust. There was laughter, and sometimes, soft weeping for those who had gone before. There were no kings, no written laws, only customs carried by memory. The people lived through trust in their leaders, in the land, and in each other. But not all hearts were the same. The ease of life brought new differences. Some worked harder than others. Some owned more tools, more animals, or more fields. Slowly, a quiet divide began to appear, not through violence, but through success. Those who had more began to see themselves as different from those who had less. They built larger homes, stored extra grain, and traded more widely. At first, they shared freely, but over time, the sharing grew smaller, and the keeping grew larger. The elders noticed this and grew worried. They reminded the people of the old stories, of when the earth was shared by all, when the giants gave without taking. But the young ones, born into the new age, saw things differently. To them, work and reward were the same. If I plant the seed, one would say, why should another eat my harvest? The words were not cruel, they were simply new, a reflection of how much the human heart had changed. This change reached into every part of life. In some villages, the people who controlled trade began to make decisions for everyone. They said who could take water from the river, who could use the clay, who could hunt in the forest. Some accepted it, for these leaders were wise and fair. Others began to whisper that too much power in one place was dangerous. But the whispers faded beneath the comfort of full bellies and safe homes. Peace, for now, still ruled. Family life had grown stronger, and its rhythms filled each day. In the mornings, the women ground grain between stones, while children gathered kindling for the fires. The men worked the fields or carved tools. At night, they returned to share a single meal, their laughter echoing through the air. In every home, small clay lamps burned softly, lighting faces with warm gold. The smell of smoke and bread was everywhere, mingling with the sound of distant drums that marked the changing hours. Rituals became a part of daily living. When a child was born, the family placed a drop of honey on its tongue, a wish for a sweet life. When someone died, they lit 3 fires, one for the body, one for the memory, and one for the path that led the spirit back to the earth. These customs brought comfort and meaning. They reminded the people that even as life grew more complicated, the circle of birth, death, and renewal never broke. The people's heart reached new beauty. Potters carved spirals into their vessels, symbols of eternity. Weavers dyed their cloth with colors of the earth, deep red from clay, green from leaves, black from ash. Their designs told stories of rivers, sun, and stars, turning ordinary tools into sacred things. The art was not only for decoration, it carried prayers. A bowl was more than a vessel, it was a wish for abundance. A painted wall was not only color, it was a blessing against drought and sickness. As the villages prospered, they began to celebrate the seasons. In the planting months, they sang songs to the soil. In harvest time, they danced from dusk to dawn. They gave thanks to the earth, to the rain, and to the unseen spirits of fertility. They believed that joy itself kept the world alive. The sound of drums echoed across valleys, carrying messages of gratitude to the mountains and sky. But beneath the music, something subtle was changing. Prosperity had made people proud. Some began to compare who had the largest harvest, who owned the most cattle, who lived in the biggest house. The differences that had once been small now stood out clearly. A few began to think that they were better than others. They wore jewelry made of shining stones and walked with heads held high. The poor still admired them, not yet seeing the danger in pride. For now, the peace of the golden age still held, but cracks had begun to appear beneath its surface. Stories too began to change. The oldest tales of the giants were still told, but they sounded more distant now, like dreams from a forgotten dawn. The new stories spoke of human heroes, brave hunters, clever inventors, wise women who saved their people. The earth, once the main character, had become a background. Humans now stood at the center of their own stories. The balance between earth and humankind had quietly shifted. In one village, near a mountain that glowed red in the setting sun, a young boy sat listening to an old storyteller. When the story ended, he asked, "Why do the giants not return?" The old man smiled sadly and said, "Because we stopped listening." The boy did not understand then, but as he grew older, those words stayed with him. They were a seed of memory, a quiet reminder that wisdom is easily lost when comfort grows too deep. Still, the villages thrived. New skills appeared: smithing, weaving, shaping clay into intricate forms. People learned to count their goods using small stones. They learned to measure time by the movement of shadows. Each step forward made life easier, but also took them further from the simple harmony of their ancestors. The earth gave them everything, yet they had begun to see her less as a mother and more as a resource. The elders noticed the change in the soil. It was tired in places, no longer giving as before. Rivers were narrower, and some animals had moved away. The people did not see this as a warning. They said, "We will dig deeper. We will plant more." And they did. The harvest returned, but the soil grew weaker each year. The earth whispered, but few listened. The first signs of inequality appeared. Some families had enough food to last through many seasons, while others struggled when the rains failed. Some homes were built of stone, others of clay. The rich painted their walls with color, the poor patched theirs with mud. Yet, there was no anger yet, only quiet resignation. They said, "The world has always been this way," though in truth, it had not. Festivals continued to mask the growing distance between hearts. The songs were still beautiful, the drums still strong, but the meaning had changed. They no longer sang just to thank the earth, they sang to show wealth and strength. Where once the fire was shared by all, now it burned brightest for the few who had the most to offer. The golden age still shimmered, but its glow came more from pride than from peace. One night, as the moon rose full above the valley, an old woman walked alone to the fields. She touched the dry soil and whispered, "You gave us more than we deserved." The wind moved through the tall grass, and for a moment, it sounded like a sigh. The earth was still alive, still patient, but she knew that her children were beginning to forget. Yet, not all hope was lost. In the quiet corners of villages, the humble still remembered. Farmers still sang to their crops. Mothers still taught their children to thank the river before drinking. Storytellers still spoke of the giants who once walked with love. The balance had not completely broken, it had only begun to tremble. And so the people continued to live, busy, proud, joyful, and blind to the thin line that separated gratitude from greed. They built taller homes, stored more grain, and planned bigger celebrations. The world looked full and bright, yet beneath it, the earth's heartbeat had started to slow. The soil, the rivers, and the wind waited silently, watching their children grow clever but forgetful. Morning always came beautifully in those days. The sunlight still fell warm on the plains, and the smell of cooking filled the air. The children still played, chasing each other through the dust. Life went on, full and rich. But if one listened closely, one could hear the faint sound of something changing, not in the earth this time, but in the hearts of those who had once walked beside her with reverence. The golden age of prosperity had given birth to comfort, and comfort had given birth to desire. The people had everything they once dreamed of, yet something within them had begun to hunger again, not for food or warmth, but for more. And as the wind carried the smoke of 1,000 fires into the evening sky, the earth whispered softly, knowing what was coming next. The nights grew longer. The air that once carried laughter from the valleys now carried whispers, quiet, uneasy, like wind moving through dry reeds. The green earth was still beautiful, but something in its rhythm had changed. It was no longer a song of harmony but one of imbalance. The fires that once symbolized togetherness now marked the separation between those who had and those who did not. The light still danced, but its warmth no longer reached everyone. The people had grown in number, their villages spreading across rivers and hills. Their fields were wide, their animals many. The sound of hammers and chisels filled the mornings, and the smoke of fires darkened the evening sky. They had learned to shape the earth itself, carving into her soil, digging deep for clay and metal, cutting down forests to build more homes. Every season brought progress, and yet, Every act of progress left a wound that few could see. The soil grew tired from too much planting. The rivers ran slower where their banks had been broken. The forests thinned until whole valleys that once sang with birds grew silent. The people noticed, but they told themselves it was nothing. "The earth is strong," they said. "She will give again." And for a while, she did. The rains still came, though shorter and sharper. The crops still grew, though smaller. The earth gave because she loved, and they took because they had forgotten what love required in return. The small cracks in their world widened slowly. Families began to guard their food. Traders demanded more for their goods. Those who had power began to use it not for guidance, but for gain. The first signs of greed appeared, not as loud battles, but as quiet choices made in secret. A leader might keep a little extra grain for himself. A trader might weigh his goods unfairly. A farmer might steal water in the night. These small acts built upon one another like stones in a wall, until the wall became too high for trust to climb. The elders saw it coming, though they could not stop it. They warned that the earth was watching, that she felt the imbalance. But the younger ones, raised in comfort, no longer believed the old songs. They laughed softly and said, "The earth does not feel. We shape her as we please." And so they did, building more, taking more, and leaving less behind. One year, the rain did not come as expected. The sky stayed pale and empty. The rivers shrank, the wells ran low, and the crops withered before harvest. The people waited for the storm clouds that had always saved them, but the sky remained still. At first, they shared what was left, remembering the old ways. But as the drought stretched on, fear began to rise. Villages started guarding their borders. Strangers were turned away. Those who had food hid it. Those who had none grew desperate. For the first time in many generations, hunger returned. In the evenings, the once lively fires now burned quietly. The songs that once praised the earth were replaced by prayers for rain. The laughter of children faded into silence. The old ones sat by the dying fires and whispered to each other, "We took too much. The earth is tired." Their voices trembled not from fear of punishment, but from sadness, a deep knowing that the balance they once had was gone. When the rain finally came, it did not bring relief. It came suddenly, violently, with thunder and wind that tore through the valleys. Fields flooded, homes washed away, and the rivers that had once been kind turned fierce and wild. The people cried out in terror, running from the very water they had prayed for. The storms raged for days, and when they ended, the land was scarred. Crops were gone, herds lost, villages broken. The people stood among the ruins of their own prosperity and realized they were not as powerful as they believed. Still, even in ruin, they tried to rebuild. The earth was kind, even in her anger. She gave again, slowly, gently, as if testing whether her children had learned. For a time, they worked together once more. They shared food, helped rebuild homes, and planted new seeds. But the memory of fear had changed them. They no longer trusted easily. The bond that once made them one people was now fragile, like thin glass that could break with one wrong word. It was during this time that the first disputes over land began. The soil near the rivers was rich again, but there was not enough for everyone. Neighbors argued about where to plant and who could drink first from the streams. At first, they tried to settle things through the old way, with gifts, with meetings, with fire and words. But soon, words turned to shouts, and shouts to blows. The first blood spilled not in defense from beasts, but from human hands. It shocked them. The man who struck first ran away and was never seen again. The people buried the dead in silence. But something had changed forever. They had learned that power could take what patience once waited for. And though they feared it, they could not unlearn it. As years passed, these small conflicts grew. Tribes began to build walls, first of stone, then of fear. They stopped traveling as freely, stopped sharing as openly. Where once there had been a world of open hands, there were now closed fists. The leaders, seeing this, began to strengthen their own power. For safety, they said. For the people. They made rules about who could trade, who could plant, who could lead. Rules became laws, and laws became chains. The earth, once shared by all, was now divided by lines no one could see but everyone felt. The elders who remembered the Golden Age still told stories to the children, stories of when life was simpler, when humans and the earth moved as one. But the children listened without believing. The world they knew was harder, colder. They grew up learning not how to share, but how to keep. And when the elders died, their stories faded into the wind, like ashes scattered on the river. In some valleys, hope still lingered. A few small groups chose to return to the old ways. They left the crowded settlements and walked back into the forests, living again with the rhythm of nature. They hunted only what they needed, planted only what they could tend, and sang the old songs by the fire. These people were seen as strange by others, poor, simple, foolish. But they were the ones who still heard the heartbeat of the earth beneath their feet. They still remembered the giants in their dreams. Elsewhere, ambition continued to grow. The villages that controlled metal or salt began to demand tribute from those that did not. Some sent messengers to claim more land, others sent warriors. The first wars were not great, only a few fights here and there, but they left scars that did not heal. The weapons that had once protected humans from beasts were now turned against each other. The earth had given them strength to survive, and now they used that strength to dominate. The balance had broken. The rivers still flowed, the stars still shone, but the peace of the green earth was gone. Humanity had entered a new age, an age of pride and struggle, where the mind that once sought harmony now sought control. The fires still burned, but they no longer united the tribes, they guarded borders. Songs still echoed in the night, but they spoke of victory instead of gratitude. The people still called themselves children of the earth, but they no longer acted like her children. They built altars and carved idols from stone, believing they could speak to the sky through their own creations. They forgot that the sky had once listened freely. They forgot that prayer without love is only noise. And yet, in the quiet places, where the forests still breathed and the rivers still sang, the old spirit of the earth remained. Sometimes, when the wind blew over the plains, carrying dust and memory, the people would stop and listen. For a moment, they would feel something familiar, a calm presence, a whisper of what once was. It would pass quickly, like a dream upon waking, but it was enough to make them pause. Enough to remind them that peace had not died, it had only been forgotten. The old ones used to say that the earth never punishes. She only reflects. When her children live in balance, she gives. When they live in greed, she mirrors it. Now, the reflection showed clearly a world full of life, yet full of emptiness. The people had built much, but they had lost more. As night fell across the valleys, fires burned in hundreds of places. Each flame flickered alone, no longer connected to the others. The stars above were distant, cold, watching as they always had. The wind moved through the fields, carrying no songs now, only the faint echo of what once had been harmony. The Golden Age had ended quietly, not with thunder or flame, but with the slow forgetting of gratitude. Still, the earth did not close her heart. She waited, patient as always, for her children to remember. Deep in her soil, beneath the roots and the rivers, the memory of the giants still slept. They had seen this cycle before, the rise, the glory, the fall. And as the world grew restless, their ancient wisdom whispered through the earth's veins, all things that rise too high must bend again toward balance. And so the people continued to live, unaware that their footsteps now carried them closer to the edge of something they could not yet see, a time when their pride would be tested, and the earth would ask once more whether her children remembered how to listen. The years that followed were quiet but uneasy. The land had recovered from drought and flood, yet something in the world no longer felt steady. The soil was fertile again, the rivers ran clear, and the trees had returned to some of the hills that were once bare. But the hearts of the people were not at peace. The cracks that had opened between them did not close with time, they spread like roots under the ground, invisible but deep. The villages had grown into towns. The small circles of homes that once shared food now stood behind walls. At first, the walls were meant to keep out wild beasts and storms, but soon they were meant to keep out each other. Men stood guard at the gates with spears of stone and metal. The same tools that once tilled the soil were now shaped for defense. The people said the world had become dangerous, but much of that danger had been made by their own hands. The earth still gave, but less freely. The rain was unpredictable now, sometimes too heavy, sometimes not at all. The air felt colder, the sky lower. Herds of animals moved farther north, chasing grass that no longer grew where it once did. The fish that filled the rivers were fewer, the forests thinner. The people began to feel that the earth herself was withdrawing, not in anger, but in silence, as if she were waiting for something. Then came the first outsiders. They came from beyond the distant mountains, following the same sun and wind that had once guided all people. They were not enemies at first, only wanderers searching for food and safety, just as their ancestors had done long ago. When they reached the valleys, they asked to stay. But the towns had changed. The people no longer saw strangers as brothers. They looked at them with suspicion and fear. Some towns opened their gates for a time, but others did not. And those who were turned away began to take by force what they could not receive in peace. The first invasions were small, raids for grain, for tools, for shelter. Yet each one left behind more than broken walls. They left behind mistrust. The towns began to build higher defenses and train their young for war. The children who once learned songs and stories now learned how to hold spears. The elders warned that this would only bring ruin, but the people answered, "If we do not fight, we will lose everything." They did not see that in preparing for war, they were already losing what mattered most. For years, the land became restless. The green plains that had once been full of peace now echoed with the sound of conflict. Smoke rose from burnt fields, and the air smelled of ash and fear. Families fled from one valley to another, carrying what little they had. Some towns vanished completely, swallowed by time and silence. Others grew stronger, ruled by those who could command both fear and loyalty. The old balance between tribes was gone. In its place came struggle, for food, for water, for control. Nature, too, seemed to mirror their turmoil. The sky turned red more often at sunset, and the winds blew from strange directions. Great storms rose from the sea, washing away coastlines. Rivers flooded without warning, sweeping away homes. In the north, ice began to creep slowly across the land, turning forests into white deserts. The earth was changing again, as if to remind her children that she was still the greater force. The people did not understand. They believed the world was punishing them, or perhaps the gods were angry. They built more altars, made more sacrifices, hoping to bring back balance. But their prayers were loud, not humble. They asked for victory, not peace. They prayed for control, not understanding. And the earth, tired and old, listened but did not answer. In one valley, a young boy named Loro watched as his town prepared for another invasion. He had never seen the world at peace, only through the stories his grandmother told him. She spoke of the time when the earth was green and kind, when giants walked slowly through the forests, and people sang more than they spoke. Her eyes grew wet when she told those tales, but Loro could not imagine such a world. To him, the earth was a place of walls and weapons, of hunger and fear. Yet in his heart, he believed her words. He believed that once, things had been different, and that maybe, they could be again. When the battle came, it was swift and cruel. The outsiders broke through the gates at dawn. Fire spread through the homes, and the sky turned black with smoke. Loro ran with his mother toward the river. Behind them, he heard cries and the clash of metal. When they reached the water, they hid among the reeds until the fighting stopped. When they returned, their home was gone, and so was his grandmother. Her stories were now only his to carry. The survivors gathered and decided to move south, to lands where the earth was said to still be gentle. They walked for many days, crossing rivers and plains, leaving behind everything they knew. Along the way, they met others who were also fleeing from drought, from war, from hunger. They shared what little they had. In that shared suffering, something all began to return: compassion. For a brief moment, the people remembered that survival had once meant helping, not hoarding. But the journey was long and full of hardship. Many fell to sickness or cold. Others lost their way in endless fields of dust. The land seemed to test them again, stripping away all pride and leaving only what was pure, the will to endure. Those who survived reached the southern plains, where the soil was still soft and green. There, they built new homes, smaller and humbler than before. They planted seeds with care, spoke kindly to strangers, and sang the old songs once more. For a time, peace returned, though it was fragile and quiet, like a candle in the wind. Far to the north, the old towns crumbled. The walls that had once protected them were now ruins covered in vines. Rivers changed course, flowing through places where streets had once been. The land reclaimed what was hers. Forests grew again, slowly covering the scars left by war. The earth was healing herself, even if her children could not. Yet, even as peace returned in small corners, new challenges appeared. The world had begun to cool. Winters were longer, harsher. The herds moved away, and the sea rose higher, swallowing coastlines where old settlements had stood. Disease began to spread, invisible, silent, deadly. It moved with travelers and traders, carried by breath and touch. Entire families fell ill, and villages that had escaped war now faced sickness. The people did not know how to fight what they could not see. Some believed it was the breath of the gods, others that the earth was cleansing herself of pain. Whatever it was, it spared no one. In the chaos, new leaders rose: healers, dreamers, and wanderers. Some used kindness to unite people again. Others used fear. They said they could speak to the spirits, that they alone could stop the sickness. Desperate, the people followed. Temples were built again, filled with offerings, chants, and tears. Hope flickered like a small flame that refused to die. Among these leaders was a woman named Nira. She lived by the sea, where the land met the endless water. She told her people that the earth was not angry, only waiting. She does not destroy, she said softly, she resets. Her words spread across valleys, carried by travelers who found comfort in her calm. Nira taught that the earth could heal if humans learned to listen once more. She told them to plant trees, to share their water, to give thanks for each breath. For many, she was a voice of peace in a time of fear. But not everyone believed her. Others saw her as a threat, claiming she spoke against the gods. They feared her strength came from somewhere forbidden. One night, her followers woke to find her gone. Some said she was taken by those who envied her peace. Others said she walked into the sea and became part of it, her spirit joining the deep to guide the earth from within. No one knew the truth, but her words lingered long after she was gone, to take without giving breaks the circle. To rule without love ends the song. The people carried those words through the years that followed. Some listened, others forgot. The wars slowed, the sickness passed, but the memory of loss stayed. The earth was no longer what it had been, yet she still carried life. The forests were smaller, but they grew. The rivers were fewer, but they flowed. The people had changed, but somewhere deep within, a small spark of the old reverence remained. Now and then, a child would stop while playing and stare at the horizon, feeling something vast and silent watching. They could not explain it, but they felt safe, as if the earth herself still whispered through the wind, forgiving, waiting, hoping. The world had entered a new age, colder, harder, yet still alive. Humanity had faced invasion, disaster, and disease, but still it endured. The giants were gone, the golden age was a memory, and the peace that followed was fragile. But the story of life, the great, unending story of the green earth, was not yet over. The earth had seen her children fall before, and she had watched them rise again. She knew that after every storm came quiet, and after every ending came another beginning. And so she turned, patient as always, as the stars wheeled above and the fires of humankind burned faintly below, small lights in the vast darkness, still searching for their way home. The years of quiet rebuilding gave people hope again. Villages had grown where ashes once lay, and laughter had returned to the fields. The people had begun to forget the long wars and the sickness. The young were strong, the old were wise, and for a moment it seemed as though the earth had forgiven them. The rivers glistened again, the grass grew thick, and herds of animals returned to the plains. The air smelled clean, and the mornings came with soft light. It was as if life had chosen to start over. But peace, though precious, is fragile. It is like the thin skin of water on a leaf, shining, delicate, and easy to break. The new world that humans built was not the same as the one they had lost. It was wiser in some ways, but prouder in others. The old lessons of balance and gratitude were remembered only in stories, and stories, no matter how beautiful, are easily forgotten when hunger for power grows again. It began quietly, as all great changes do. One tribe near the mountains discovered that the stones beneath their land burned hotter than ordinary fire. They learned to melt the metal hidden inside and shape it into weapons stronger than any seen before. With these new tools, they hunted more easily, defended more fiercely, and soon grew powerful. Other tribes, seeing their strength, came to trade, but they also came to envy. The mountain tribe became proud of what they had created. They began to believe they were chosen by the earth herself to rule the valleys. "The fire beneath our feet speaks to us," their leaders said. "It burns only for the worthy." They began to demand tribute from other villages, grain, cloth, and young workers. At first, the others gave willingly, not wanting conflict. But when the demands grew greater, resentment began to stir. One night, a small group from a river village refused to send their offering. "The fire belongs to all," they said. "No one owns the gifts of the earth." Their words spread like wind through dry grass, and soon many villages began to agree. The mountain tribe called it rebellion. The river people called it freedom. And so began the first true war, not for food or survival, but for pride and control. The war lasted through many seasons. Villages burned, fields were trampled, and families were torn apart. The earth, once green and calm, turned gray with ash. Rivers ran red during the battles, and smoke covered the sky for weeks at a time. The songs of birds fell silent. The people fought not against hunger or cold this time, but against themselves. In the middle of the war stood two friends who had once grown up together, Kale, a hunter from the river valley, and Taran, a craftsman from the mountains. When they were children, they had played by the same streams and built the same fires. They had promised that their people would always share what they found. But when the war began, they stood on opposite sides. Kale led the river people. He fought not to conquer, but to protect. The earth is not ours, he said to his people. We are hers. Terran, however, believed the power of fire was destiny. The strong must lead, he told his warriors. Only then can we keep order. Both believed they were right. Both thought they fought for peace. And that was the saddest truth, that war often begins with good intentions lost to pride. The battles were fierce. The mountain warriors struck hard with their new weapons, and the river people fought with determination. Villages fell one after another. The sky filled with smoke until the stars disappeared. The earth shook with the weight of conflict, and the rivers that once connected them now divided them with blood. When the war finally ended, there was no victory. The mountain tribe had won by force, but they had lost everything else. The fire that had made them powerful had also destroyed their land. The mines collapsed, the soil turned to dust, and the rivers near the mountains dried up. The air there was thick and bitter, the taste of metal lingering in every breath. The river people were broken too, their homes ruined, their fields gone. They had fought bravely, but now they had nothing left to protect. Kale and Terran met one last time on the battlefield, surrounded by silence. The smoke still rose behind them, and the ground beneath their feet was black and lifeless. They looked at each other for a long moment, too tired for anger, too broken for pride. We were friends once, Kale said softly. Terran nodded, his eyes wet. We both wanted the same thing, he answered, but we forgot what it was. Neither spoke again. The wind blew between them, carrying ashes that fell like snow. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled across the mountains, not in rage, but in sorrow. The earth mourned quietly for her children, who had forgotten how to listen. After the war, the survivors wandered. Some returned to the sea, others to the forests. Many gave up fighting altogether. They built smaller villages again, humbler this time, closer to the old ways. They prayed not for victory, but for forgiveness. They buried their dead with care, whispering to the ground, "We are sorry." For a few generations, peace returned. The people were fewer, but kinder. They taught their children to plant trees where fires had burned and to thank the soil for every harvest. They remembered Kale and Terran not as heroes, but as warnings, reminders that pride could turn even friendship into ruin. But time moves as the rivers do, always forward, never still. New generations grew, and with them came new dreams. The scars of the old war faded from memory. The fields grew rich again, the towns stronger. The new leaders looked at the ruins of the old world and saw not a lesson, but an opportunity. They dug into the same mountains, searching once again for the fire metal. "We will use it wisely this time," they promised. But wisdom, once lost, is not so easily found again. Soon the glow of forges filled the night sky once more. The sound of hammers returned, echoing through valleys that had once been silent. People built stronger walls, taller towers, and sharper weapons. They believed they had mastered the fire that had once destroyed them. And for a time, it seemed true. Their cities flourished. Trade grew beyond anything their ancestors could imagine. They built roads of stone and sailed across wide waters. They believed they had finally conquered the earth. But the earth cannot be conquered. She endures, she waits, and she remembers. Beneath the stone roads, her heart still beat. Beneath the cities, her silence still whispered. And though her children walked proudly across her skin, she knew that the same cycle had begun again, of growth, of pride, of fall. The people forgot that the earth had limits. They took from her faster than she could give. They cut deeper into her mountains, drew more metal, burned more forests, and filled the rivers with waste. The land grew weary again, the air thick with smoke. The skies that had once been clear now hung low and gray. The first tremors came quietly. The ground shook beneath cities built too high. The seas rose and swallowed coastlines. Rain fell in strange seasons, flooding lands that had never known storms. The people called it bad luck, but the earth was only responding, balancing herself once more. Some still remembered the old stories. They spoke of the giants and the early people who lived with the land instead of ruling it. They begged their leaders to stop digging, to stop burning, to stop taking more than they needed. But the leaders did not listen. They said the world was theirs by right. They said progress could not be stopped. And then came the betrayal, the turning point that ended all doubt. One city, high on a hill and proud of its power, broke the final bond of trust. Its rulers, hungry for dominance, poisoned the river that ran through the plains below, hoping to weaken their rivals. The water turned black, the fish died, and the people downstream fell sick. Children cried from thirst, and their parents cursed the city above. The betrayal spread like fire through the land, and soon every alliance shattered. The earth, too, felt the wound. The poisoned river no longer sang, it only whispered death. The plants along its banks turned brown. The animals that drank from it fell silent. The river that had once been a source of life had become a reminder of what humanity had become. The people who still remembered the old ways fled to the forests, trying to save what little was left. They carried seeds, clean water, and the memory of peace. "We will start again," they said. "We will live as our ancestors did." But they were few, and the world around them was loud with greed and anger. One night, a storm unlike any other swept across the land. The ground split open, rivers overflowed, and the mountains groaned as if alive. Lightning struck the towers of the proud cities, and fire spread through their streets. When the storm ended, the sky was black, and the world was changed. Many cities were gone, swallowed by the earth. The rivers carved new paths, and the sea moved inland, reclaiming what was once hers. The people who survived looked upon the ruins and understood at last what they had done. The earth did not destroy them out of hate, she only reminded them of truth, that life cannot grow where greed has taken root. The betrayal of one river had brought ruin to all rivers, and through it, the earth had spoken. When dawn came, the survivors stepped out into a world washed clean. The air smelled different, raw, heavy with rain and ash. The sky was pale, and for the first time in generations, it was silent. No hammer, no song, no fire. Only the heartbeat of the earth, slow and steady beneath their feet. And so ended the age of pride, the turning point that broke the circle once again. But even in ruin, there was a strange peace. The people who remained looked at each other and saw not enemies, but kin. They walked together to the rivers, now calm, and drank with reverence. Some wept. Some smiled through their tears. The earth had not ended them, she had simply begun again. The storm that had ended the age of pride did not fade quickly. For many days, the sky stayed dark, the air thick with dust and rain. The people who survived moved through silence, afraid to speak too loudly, as if their voices might disturb the fragile balance that had returned. The earth felt alive again, but her strength was heavy and unfamiliar, like the breath of something ancient awakening from long sleep. The cities that once stood proudly on the hills were gone. Only broken stones remained, scattered like bones across the plains. The tall towers that had once reached for the sky were now leaning shadows swallowed by mist. The roads of stone cracked under roots and water. The air smelled of ash, of soil, of new beginnings and endings all at once. Nature was reclaiming what had always been hers. The survivors gathered wherever the land was still kind. They built small shelters by rivers that still ran clean, and they learned once more to depend on one another. Many were silent for weeks, unable to speak of what they had seen, the floods that swallowed entire valleys, the lightning that split mountains in half, the wind that howled like the voice of a forgotten god. They had seen their world fall, and yet, in the quiet after, there was strange peace. The fall was not sudden in every place. Some cities lingered, broken but alive. In the far south, a few strongholds stood against the chaos. The rulers who survived believed they could rebuild what was lost. They sent people to clear the ruins, to dig the soil, to light fires once more. But the earth would not bend so easily this time. The fields refused to grow. The rivers changed direction. Each attempt to rebuild only brought new hardship, drought where rain was expected, storms where calm had always been. Slowly, the survivors understood that they were not rebuilding, they were being rebuilt. The earth was shaping them again, stripping away what was unnecessary, reminding them what it meant to be small. The proud forgot their crowns, the strong forgot their power, and the wise began to listen again. It was a humbling that came not through punishment, but through silence. In one valley where the soil had stayed fertile, a small group of families settled. They planted seeds and waited. The first shoots were weak, but they grew. They sang to the plants as their ancestors had done, whispering the old songs that spoke of gratitude and patience. It was a slow, uncertain time, but it was peaceful. They learned to live with less, to take only what they needed, and to share everything again. The elders began to tell the children stories about the past, not of greatness or war, but of humility. Remember, they said, the earth gives, but she also takes back. Treat her as you would your own mother. Far away, other groups tried to survive in different ways. Some traveled endlessly, afraid to settle, thinking the ground itself might betray them again. They moved from forest to forest, mountain to mountain, living on what they could find. Others sought refuge in caves, carving symbols on the walls, pictures of the stars, the rivers, the animals that had vanished. They wanted to leave behind something that could speak when their voices could not. Among these survivors, there were those who still dreamed of the old world. They could not forget the glow of fire that once lit the cities or the strength of the towers that reached the clouds. They whispered of rebuilding, of rising again. We have learned from our mistakes, they said. We can make the earth serve us without breaking her. But the older ones shook their heads. You do not serve the earth, they replied softly. You walk with her, or you are lost. As the years passed, the memory of the Great Fall became a legend. Children born after the storm grew up among ruins, never knowing the world that came before. To them, the broken stones were simply part of the landscape, the same way rivers and trees were. They played among the remains of temples, chasing each other through pillars carved long ago, unaware that those same pillars once carried the pride that led to ruin. They asked the elders, who built these, and the elders answered, the ones who forgot to listen. The children nodded and went back to their games, but the story stayed with them, deep in their hearts. The earth healed slowly. Green returned to the valleys. Forests grew thick again where fields had been. The animals came back, first the small ones, then the larger. Birds filled the skies once more, singing as if they had been waiting for quiet to return. The rivers that had turned black now ran clear, their surfaces reflecting the sun like mirrors. The earth was breathing again, and though her breath was quieter, it carried life. In the ruins of one of the old cities, vines covered the stones, creeping over walls that once held the laughter of thousands. Flowers bloomed where soldiers had fallen. Grass grew through cracks in the streets. The wind moved softly through open arches, carrying no sound of hammers or wheels, only the gentle hum of time. The earth had reclaimed her children, and in doing so, she had forgiven them. The few who still wandered spoke of strange things they had seen, lights in the distance that moved like stars upon the ground, voices in the wind that called their names, and shadows that looked like the shapes of the giants their ancestors once knew. Some said the earth herself was speaking again, reminding them of the first covenant, that life must live with her, not against her. For many generations, humans lived quietly, spread thin across the land. The stories of pride and fall became mornings told around fires at night. Do not dig too deep, they would say. Do not take too much. The old songs returned, sung softly as people worked the soil. The circle had closed again, though smaller this time, gentler. The people had learned that peace was not given, it was earned, and it could be lost if forgotten. But the memory of greatness never truly disappeared. It hid in the hearts of dreamers, those who looked at the stars and wondered what else was possible. They were not evil, only curious, just as the first people had been. One such dreamer was a young woman named Sarah, born long after the fall. She loved to wander through the ruins and touch the carvings on the stone walls. She would ask her grandfather, did they really make the mountains of metal? And he would smile sadly. They thought they could, he said. But in trying, they forgot how to be human. Sarah listened but could not help imagining what it must have been like, the cities, the lights, the endless songs. She felt no desire for power, only for understanding. If they could shape metal, she thought, maybe they could also shape peace. She began to collect old tools she found buried under soil, studying their shapes and wondering what they meant. She did not see them as weapons, but as puzzles left behind by time. The earth seemed to guide her. One day, while walking near the edge of a river, she found a single polished stone, carved with a spiral. It was smooth, cool, and perfect in her hand. When she held it to her ear, she thought she could hear faint echoes, not voices, but a rhythm, steady and deep. She brought it home and showed her grandfather. His eyes widened. That is from before, he whispered. It is a mark of the old ones. He told her to keep it safe, for it carried memory. That night, Sarah sat by the fire and held the stone close. She listened to its quiet hum and whispered to the earth, we are still here. The wind answered softly, moving through the trees like a sigh. And for the first time in many years, she felt that the earth was listening again. The world that followed the fall was quieter but wiser. The people no longer built great towers or carved deep into mountains. They lived closer to the soil, closer to the rivers, closer to the truth that everything living shared one breath. They no longer tried to own the earth, for they had learned that the earth could never be owned, only loved. Still, the ruins remained as reminders. They stood half buried in grass, silent but not forgotten. Travelers who passed them often felt a shiver, as if the stones still carried the voices of those who built them. Some said that at night, when the moon was full, the ruins glowed faintly, not from fire, but from memory. The earth did not erase her past, she preserved it, so that one day, when her children were ready, they might remember what had been lost and what had been found again. And so the world rested. The rivers ran, the forests grew, and the winds carried stories across the land. Humanity had fallen, but it had not vanished. It had returned to its beginning, small, humble, alive. The green earth, though scarred, was whole once more. She had seen ages rise and fall, and through it all, she remained, patient and forgiving. And in her quiet heart, she held a promise that as long as there were those who remembered, the song of life would never end. Time moved gently after the fall, and the world seemed content to rest. The green earth had returned to quiet, its rivers calm, its forests deep. People lived in small villages again, scattered like stars across wide valleys. They no longer built towers or carved their names into the land. Instead, they lived in rhythm with the wind, the rain, and the soil. Each sunrise brought work, and each sunset brought peace. The world was smaller, but it was alive. Generations passed, and the ruins of the old world sank deeper into the ground. Grass covered broken stones, trees grew where temples once stood, and rivers changed their courses to flow through streets that had long forgotten human feet. Yet, beneath the soil, the memory of what had been remained. Hidden chambers still slept under hills. Fragments of metal, glass, and bone lay untouched, waiting to be found. The earth never forgets, she only hides until the time is right. The people of this new age lived with care. They had learned from their ancestors' mistakes, even if they did not remember all the reasons why. The elders taught that the earth was alive, not as a story, but as truth. They told the young ones that the wind carried voices, that rivers listened, and that mountains held memories. And though the children sometimes laughed, deep down, they believed. When they walked barefoot on the soil, they could feel something under their feet, a soft pulse, steady and ancient, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. But the earth has her own ways of stirring curiosity. One day, while digging near a dry riverbed, a young boy found something strange, a smooth stone that shone like metal. It was small, round, and cool to the touch. When he showed it to the elders, they stared for a long time. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. "It is from the world before ours," said the oldest among them. "From when people knew too much." The boy asked what it was used for, but no one could answer. They only said, "Keep it safe, and never forget that even the smallest thing can wake the past." As the years passed, more such objects began to appear. Hunters found them buried beneath roots. Farmers found them in the soil. Pieces of tools, fragments of walls, and stones that glowed faintly when touched. Some believed they were gifts from the earth, returning what she had once taken. Others whispered that they were warnings, reminders of what had been lost when humans forgot to listen. The discoveries awakened something inside the people, curiosity, wonder, and fear. The elders were cautious, but the young were restless. They wanted to know where these strange things came from. They wanted to uncover the stories hidden in the earth. "Maybe," said one, "our ancestors left them for us to learn." Another replied, "Or to warn us never to follow their path." Yet no one could resist the pull of the unknown. Slowly, people began to dig deeper. They built small pits at first, then tunnels. In one valley, they uncovered a wall made of smooth stone that did not crumble like the others. It was covered in markings, lines, and shapes they could not read. The villagers gathered around it every night, staring by firelight, wondering what it meant. Some said it was a message from the gods. Others thought it was the voice of the earth itself, written in a forgotten language. The more they looked, the more they felt both awe and unease. The old ones grew worried. "The earth hides her secrets for a reason," they said. "If we disturb her rest, she may remind us again how fragile we are." But the young ones only smiled. "We will not be like those before us," they promised. "We seek knowledge, not power." They believed it, and maybe, for a while, it was true. In one such village, Sarah, now older, with lines of wisdom across her face, heard of the discoveries. She had kept her spiral stone for many years, always listening to its quiet hum. When she heard of the strange wall, she traveled far to see it. The journey took many days through forests and fields, but she walked with calm steps, guided by instinct. When she arrived and saw the carvings, she placed her hand on the stone. It felt warm, almost alive. The markings glowed faintly under her fingers, like embers waking from sleep. The others stepped back in fear, but Sarah smiled. "It remembers us," she whispered. "It never forgot." The villagers asked what it meant, but she could not explain. All she knew was that the earth was speaking again, in her own way, through what was left behind. She told them to leave the wall as it was, untouched, respected. "The past should not be stolen," she said. "It should be understood." For a time, her words were followed. The wall became a sacred place, where people left flowers and whispered prayers. But elsewhere, others were not so careful. The more that was uncovered, the more people wanted to find. Old greed, quiet for so long, began to stir again. If the earth holds such wonders, some said, perhaps she holds power too. The line between curiosity and desire blurred, as it always does. Digging spread from valley to valley. People began to trade the strange objects they found, shining stones, pieces of glass that caught the light, fragments of metal that hummed faintly in the dark. Some claimed these objects had magic. Others said they could hear faint voices through them at night. Whether true or not, belief grew, and with it, obsession. The elders gathered one evening beneath a great tree to speak. "The circle is turning again," said one. "We see what our ancestors saw, and we are walking the same path." Another replied, "Perhaps it is not fate. Perhaps this time we can remember before it is too late. But memory is fragile when wonder burns bright." The young listened politely, nodded, and continued their digging. In time, the earth began to react. The ground trembled more often. Rivers changed course again, and strange lights were seen over the mountains at night, not fire, not stars, but something between both. The people grew uneasy. They spoke less of discovery and more of balance, remembering Sarah's words. But curiosity, once awakened, is hard to silence. Then, one night, a storm rolled over the valley. Lightning struck near the sacred wall, and the markings glowed brighter than ever before. The air shimmered with light, and the villagers fell to their knees in fear. When the storm ended, the wall was cracked down the middle, and where it split open, there was a deep hollow, a chamber that led beneath the earth. No one dared enter at first. The air that came from within was cold and dry, and it smelled not of soil, but of metal and dust. Sarah, old but unafraid, stepped forward. She held her spiral stone and said softly, "The earth has chosen to show us again. We must listen this time." She entered the chamber with a small group of others. Inside, they found more walls covered with markings, and strange shapes half buried in the ground, circles, rods, and plates made of materials they did not know. There were even carvings of human figures, but their eyes were shaped differently, and their hands were long. It was as if they were both human and something more. Sarah touched one of the carvings and felt warmth again, though no fire burned there. "They were like us," she said quietly. "They loved, they built, they forgot." Her voice echoed softly through the chamber, like a purr whispered through time. When she returned to the surface, she told the people what she had seen. "The earth remembers everything," she said. "Even our mistakes. The giants, the first people, the rise, the fall, it is all part of her song. We cannot escape it, but we can choose how we dance to it." Her words spread far beyond the valley, carried by travelers and traders. Some listened and found peace. Others ignored them and continued to search for more relics, hoping to find the secret that would make them powerful again. The earth watched quietly, patient as always. She did not punish, but she reminded, through tremors, through whispers in the wind, through the rhythm of rain. The people who understood her language lived in harmony, taking little, giving much. Those who did not began to vanish, their villages swallowed by landslides, floods, or silence. The balance was being restored, not by anger, but by truth. As time went on, the relics of the old world became fewer. Some were lost again, buried by the earth herself. Others were kept safe by those who still remembered Sarah's teachings. They built no temples, only small circles of stone, where they gathered to tell the story of the giants, of the rise and fall, of the endless circle of life and forgetting. At night, when the fires burned low, they would look to the stars and wonder if somewhere out there, the giants still walked, watching, guiding, waiting for the earth's children to finally understand. And sometimes, when the wind blew softly across the fields, they could almost hear a deep voice in the distance, not in words, but in feeling, a reminder that all things that live are part of one breath. The earth was calm again, and humanity was humble once more. The mysteries beneath her skin remained vast and endless, like dreams waiting to be remembered. And so, under the quiet sky, life continued, smaller, wiser, and more connected to the soil that had always been its home. The world was quiet and kind after the long storms, and people learned to walk softly again. Villages rose like small lights along rivers and hill paths, not to conquer the land but to share it. Children grew up among green fields and gentle stories, and the ruins of the old world were no longer something to fear. They were reminders, like the wrinkles on a wise face. The earth breathed calmly, and the people matched their breathing to hers. From this quiet, a new way of living began. It did not start with kings or great walls. It started with simple habits that made sense. Neighbors met at the river each morning and agreed on how much water each family would take. They marked the hours by the length of shadows and counted the months by the full moon. They kept seeds from the strongest plants in clay jars and chose 2 people in each village to be keepers of the jars, so no one would go hungry when the rain failed. When travelers came, they were given bread, water, and a place by the fire. In time, these habits became customs, and customs became gentle law. Words changed too. New names grew from old memories. Many languages called the river mother, the field listener, the wind messenger, and the soil the old one. Children learned these words before they learned to count. In the evening, elders told stories that linked each word to a lesson. Share at the river, or the river will share you with the sea. Plant with the moon, harvest with the sun. Leave a third for the birds and the poor. These were not rules written on stone. They were promises held in the heart. Songs became the first teachers. People sang when they planted, so the children would know how deep to place a seed. They sang when they ground grain, so the rhythm would keep hands steady. They sang the names of herbs and what each plant could heal. A small village with strong songs could live through a hard season better than a rich one with weak memory. So they built houses of breath where anyone could come at night to learn the songs. Breath by breath, village by village, memory turned into culture. Soon, small paths joined the villages like threads. Travelers carried baskets, stories, and news. At bends in the road, people raised simple markers, 3 stacked stones or a carved stick with a spiral, to show the next well or shelter. These markers had no owner. They belonged to everyone who walked. At the edge of each village, a flat stone was set in the ground. On it, visitors placed a small gift, a leaf, a pebble, a little food, before they entered. This was the stone of thanks, and stepping over it reminded both guest and host that kindness was the first law. Crafts grew patient and beautiful. Potters shaped bowls with wide lips so water would not spill. Weavers copied the flow of rivers in their cloth, the bend of grass in their patterns. Builders learned to place doorways so wind could pass through rooms without carrying ash from the fire. Roofs curved like shells, and walls were thick at the base like tree trunks. Nothing was fancy for its own sake. Everything was useful first, and beautiful because it fit the world. People kept the old circles of stone, but now they stood not as boasts, but as calendars. On the shortest day, the sun touched one stone, on the longest day, it touched another. Children gathered to watch the light move, and elders told the story of time. The world turns, the light returns, and we return to each other. These circles helped plant the fields on time, gather for rain prayers, and remember the dead with quiet dignity. The sky became a book again, and everyone learned to read at least a few pages. New leaders appeared, different from the loud rulers of the old age. They were called listeners, tenders, or simply the calm ones. A listener sat between 2 angry neighbors and asked each to speak until the heat left their voice. A tender walked the borders after storms and noted where the land was hurt. The calm ones spoke last at meetings and often spoke the fewest words. Villages chose them not because they wanted power, but because they were steady in times when others shook. Trade returned, but it learned humility. People began to agree on simple weights, a smooth stone, a small clay measure, so no one would cheat without everyone noticing. Markets met by water, and the first rule never changed: no one went home hungry from a market day. If someone had nothing to trade, others found a reason to share. "You brought your feet," a potter would say with a smile. "Sit and rest." That is your trade today. Through such small kindness, trust grew strong again. Old fears softened into useful caution. Forests were cut only where new trees would grow. Fire was used carefully, never allowed to run wild. People set aside pieces of land where no one hunted or gathered, calling them the quiet places. They believed the earth needed rooms of her own, the same way a mother needs sleep. In return, the quiet places fed the rivers, sheltered birds, and let the deer grow strong. Children were taken there to sit and listen. The first lesson of those visits was silence. The second was gratitude. Even stories about the giants changed. Long ago, the giants had been told as if they were gods. Now they were told as elder brothers who had taught without words. The curve of a mammoth's tusk became a sign of patience, the slow step of the great rhino a sign of care. People carved small figures of these animals and set them near doorways, not to worship them, but to remember to walk gently. The giants were still gone, but their spirit was present in how hands moved and how feet fell. Some knowledge from the old world returned, but in softer forms. People sketched the stars on smooth bark and used them to guide boats along friendly coasts. They tracked the wind with rows of hanging shells and learned when storms would come. They pressed plants between leaves to keep a record of medicine. They counted better but never let counting rule kindness. If the numbers make you forget the eyes, elders warned, start counting again. Justice grew from repair, not revenge. If a person ruined a field, they worked that field until it was green again. If someone stole, they ate with the person they stole from until trust returned. Villages kept a bench of return, a simple seat in the center where wrongs were faced and healed. The work was slow, but it mended more than injury. It mended the path between hearts. People began to say, it is not enough to fix the thing. We must fix the space between us. Language carried these changes forward. Words for minds softened, words for ours sharpened. Many tongues created a single short word that meant enough. It was used at markets, at meetings, and at meals. Enough meant stop where peace can still hold. Children learned to say it aloud when they felt desire growing too large. In some places, they made a small gesture with the hand, palm down, fingers settling, to mimic a bird coming to rest. This was the sign for enough. Little schools appeared, often just a circle of stones in the shade. In the mornings, children learned to measure a day with a stick and a line on the ground. At midday, they learned the names of plants and the signs of tracks. In the evening, they learned stories, the old ones about the rise and fall, and the newer ones about how to keep a village steady. The last lesson was always the same: before you sleep, thank 3 things. Some thanked water, bread, and a friend. Others thanked shade, a tool that worked, and the laugh of a child. Gratitude trained the mind the way walking trains the legs. Travel widened again as trust grew. People set up house rests along long paths, simple shelters with a jar of water, a little grain, and a place to lie down. No tolls were charged. The price of rest was a promise: leave the shelter as you would like to find it. Over time, these houses became places where news, songs, and seeds traveled farther than any one person could walk. If a village lost its crop to hail, seed from a distant valley arrived before the next moon. Craft guilds formed, but they felt like families. Potters shared kills. Weavers exchanged patterns. Metalworkers, careful now, set their forges near water and planted trees to balance what the fire took. Apprentices learned 2 crafts whenever possible. One feeds your hands, masters said. The other feeds your heart. In hard years, you will need both. Festivals tied the year together like knots along a rope. Planting feasts were quiet and hopeful, harvest feasts were bright and open. Between them stood 2 nights of remembering, one for the giants and one for the cities. On those nights, lamps were placed on doorways and along paths to the river. People walked in silence and let the water carry the light downstream. Some lamps reached the sea. Children cheered softly, and elders smiled. The lamps were not for grief. They were for balance, light offered back to the dark. From these small ways grew a culture that other peoples noticed. Words traveled. Customs traveled. In distant valleys, you could arrive and understand the rules without speaking the language, the stone of thanks, the enough sign, the bench of return, the quiet place outside the fields, the house rest at the path's bend. A web of gentle law crossed mountains and rivers without a single ruler to command it. It worked because the earth herself seemed to bless anything that kept her rhythms. There were still mistakes. Sometimes a village grew proud and gathered more than it should. Sometimes a trader cheated. Sometimes a leader forgot to listen. But now the repair came sooner. Nearby villages sent singers, not soldiers. The singers brought market scales, stories of other places, and the old songs that made people remember who they were. Often that was enough. If not, the quiet places were enlarged, a season of fasting from woodcutting was declared, and the land itself led the lesson back toward balance. As years became lifetimes, the New World shaped languages, law, and art so deeply that even distant peoples felt the echo. A word for the shared river appeared in many tongues. A rule that the first and last drink from a pitcher went to guests spread along the coast. A design of a spiral inside a circle, Sarah's stone, remembered or rediscovered, found its way onto door lintels, boat prows, and the rims of bowls. The spiral meant memory, the circle meant return. Even the way people prayed changed. Instead of asking for more, they began to ask for right measure. Give us the right rain, they said. Give us the right hunger so we will not forget the taste of bread. Give us the right sorrow so we remember to hold each other. In their simple words, they found a kind of wisdom that protected them better than walls. This way of living did not make everyone gentle, and it did not remove all pain. Storms still came. Rivers still rose. People still argued, grew jealous, and made errors that cost them dearly. But now the culture itself knew how to bend without breaking. Like a tree that leans in wind and stands straight when it passes, the villages learned to move with trouble rather than against it. The legacy of the giants showed in daily choices more than in monuments. It was in the way a child stepped off a path to let an ant column pass. It was in the way people counted fish and put every 10th one back. It was in the way laughter was shared like bread and silence was shared like shade. When travelers from far lands asked what ruled these valleys, the people pointed to the river, the sky, and the fields and said, "These do." In time, a few wrote symbols on bark to keep calendars and seed lists. Others tied knots and cords to count jars, births, and storms. Writing did not make them proud this time. It made them precise. Words on bark forget tone, elders warned, so sing them too. And so every written record had a sung partner, and the voice kept the heart inside the numbers. Slowly, this gentler wisdom flowed outward. Terraces held hillsides steady where rain once tore the soil. Canals were lined with reeds to protect fish nurseries. Fire was used in small circles to clean fields without scarring forests. People marked listening days when markets paused and neighbors walked their fields together, naming what the land needed before anyone spoke of what they wanted. Cities did not rise again as before, but towns with wide commons appeared, planned around wind and shade rather than pride and height. If you walked through these towns at dusk, you would hear a blend of many languages calling children home, pots tapping softly, a drum somewhere counting the slow turn of evening. You would see a small figure of a mammoth at one door and a sprig of green at another. You would notice a bench under a tree with smooth arms from many hands. You would feel that even if you were a stranger, you had already been expected, and the first drink was waiting. This was the legacy that later peoples inherited without knowing its full story, a way of speaking that kept the earth in the sentence, a way of trading that left room for mercy, a way of judging that healed the space between people, a way of building that remembered wind and light, a way of praying that asked for measure rather than more. Even when names changed and roads reached farther than the old songs ever dreamed, these small threads held. And when a child, in any age, stood at the edge of a field at sunrise and felt the world breathe, a slow, deep breath that seemed to rise from the soil itself, the child joined the oldest classroom. The lesson was always the same and always new: walk lightly, take your turn, return what you can, thank what you cannot return. In that lesson, the giants still walked, the rivers still taught, and the earth still turned her face toward those who remembered. Night comes to every age, and so does morning. The people of this gentler time knew both and learned to pass their wisdom forward without pride. They did not say, "We are better." They said, "We are learning again." And as they slept, the wind moved through the quiet places and over the stones of thanks, and the stars wrote the same old message across the sky, patient and bright: keep the circle. What came next would test that circle once more, as all circles are tested, by comfort, by hunger, by fear, and by the easy forgetting that follows a long peace. But for now, the world rested in the soft light of what it had learned, and the path ahead could be seen clearly for a few steps. That was enough to walk on. After many generations of calm living, the world felt whole again. The earth was green, the rivers clean, and people had learned to live gently. Every valley carried its own song, and each song sounded different yet familiar. Life moved slowly, peacefully. But the earth, wise and old, knew that peace is not the end of a story. It is a breath before the next change. The quiet years made people comfortable. They began to take safety for granted. Crops always grew, rains always came, and families always had enough. Children born in this age knew no war, no hunger, no fear. They were kind, but they did not understand how precious peace was. When something exists too long without challenge, it begins to lose its meaning. So it was again. The world had forgotten the sharpness that makes gratitude real. At first, the change was small. People started to want more. They wanted brighter dyes for their cloth, bigger houses, heavier ornaments. Traders brought new ideas from distant valleys. Why not build faster, they said. Why not store more? They spoke of wealth not as a danger, but as a reward for cleverness. The elders frowned but said little. They had seen such beginnings before, and they feared that words alone could not stop the tide. Some villages grew rich quickly. Their markets filled with tools, beads, and fine pottery. Songs about the earth's balance slowly gave way to songs about success and pride. People began to say, "The land is generous because we work harder than others." Few remembered that the earth's generosity had nothing to do with work or worth, it was simply her way of loving her children. In other places, the earth started to whisper warnings. The rivers shrank a little each year, the soil turned lighter, and the air grew drier. The wise ones noticed and called for restraint. "Let the fields rest," they said. "Let the forests heal." But the younger ones laughed. "We know better now," they said. "We have learned from the past. The earth will not harm us again." And so they kept digging, planting, and building, certain that they were different from those who came before. The first signs of imbalance appeared quietly, like the faint crack in a pot before it breaks. Animals began to move away from their usual paths. Rains came too early or too late. Wells dried faster, and the fruit trees bore less each season. When these things happened, people found explanations that made sense to them. The weather has changed, they said. It will pass. But the earth was speaking clearly, only no one was listening anymore. One evening, in a small valley near the sea, an old woman stood before her people. Her name was Mirren, and she was the last of the listeners, those who still heard the earth's voice in the wind. "We're drifting again," she told them. "We have begun to forget. The earth gives signs before she acts, and we must listen now, or the old circle will repeat." But her words fell softly on deaf ears. The people were busy celebrating a new festival, one that honored human skill rather than nature's grace. They cheered and danced as Mirren's quiet voice was lost in the music. Yet her words lingered in a few hearts, mostly among children, who still had ears for wonder. One boy, Taro, often followed Mirren to the riverbanks, where she sat and listened to the water. "What do you hear?" he asked. "Everything," she answered. "The river tells me what the mountains have lost, what the trees remember, and what the sea will bring. If you listen long enough, the earth will tell you what she needs." Taro tried to listen too. He sat by the river until his ears buzzed with sound, wind, insects, rustling leaves, trickling water, and slowly he began to understand that these sounds were not random. They had patterns, like speech, like breath. He could not translate them into words, but he felt their meaning. It was peace, but also warning. Years later, when Mirren was gone and Taro had become a man, the warnings grew louder. Storms became stronger. Rivers rose higher. The sea began to creep inland again. The people were frightened. They built walls and dug channels, but nothing worked. They prayed to gods they barely remembered and made sacrifices of food, but the earth did not answer. She had grown quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes before great change. Taro remembered Mirren's teachings. He told his people to stop building and listen. "The earth is not angry," he said. "She is only asking us to slow down." But the others laughed, saying, "We cannot stop. We have too much to lose." They did not realize that what they feared losing had already begun to slip away. In time, the storms returned more often. Floods swept through valleys, and droughts followed. Crops failed, and forests fell to wind and fire. It was not as fast or as violent as the great fall of old, but it was steady, patient, and complete. The earth does not hurry, she waits for her children to understand. When the floods took the largest town by the sea, people began to remember the old stories again. They spoke of the first rise and fall, of the giants, of the fires, and of the silence that followed. The memory that had slept in their blood awoke. The elders called for a gathering. They sat under a wide tree, hundreds of people from many valleys, and they spoke not of rebuilding, but of remembering. Taro stood before them, holding a bowl of river water. "This," he said, "is the voice we ignored. It does not speak in words, but it tells us everything. It reflects our faces, but it also carries our mistakes. If we poison it, we drink that poison ourselves. If we respect it, it heals us." He poured the water onto the ground, and the soil drank it. The people bowed their heads in silence. From that day, something changed again, not in the world, but in the hearts of those who survived. They began to listen as their ancestors once did. They planted fewer fields but cared for them more. They left wide spaces for forests to breathe. They traveled less, but when they did, they traveled with purpose, not to take, but to share. And slowly, balance returned once more. The earth softened. The storms lessened. The rivers grew gentle again. It was as though she had exhaled after holding her breath for too long. The air smelled clean. The nights grew quiet, filled only with the steady hum of life. Taro grew old and sat often by the river where he had once learned to listen. He taught children the same way Mira had taught him. "The earth always speaks," he said. "We only need to be still enough to hear her." The children listened, their faces calm and curious. "What will she say next?" one asked. Taro smiled. "That depends on us." The generations that followed Taro lived carefully. They built their homes on high ground, away from the river's fury. They kept their fires small and their hearts humble. The ruins of the old towns by the sea were left untouched, their stones covered in moss and vines. The people visited them each year, not to mourn, but to learn. They placed their hands on the stones and whispered thanks to those who had come before, those who had fallen so that others might remember. Art changed too. People began to carve spirals again, like the one on Sarah's stone, but this time they carved two spirals intertwined, one for rise, one for fall. Together they meant balance. These carvings were placed on doorways, on cups, even on walking sticks. They reminded everyone that the world does not move in a straight line. It turns, it returns, it breathes. Language changed once more. The people stopped using words for rule or conquer. Instead, they spoke of care, guard, and balance. Their songs became simpler again, filled with gratitude. Children learned them as easily as breathing. "Thank the wind," one song said. "Thank the rain. Thank the fire that cooks and the soil that forgives." But even in this peace, the elders taught vigilance. "We are never done learning," they said. "Every age believes it will not forget, and every age forgets in its own way. The circle always tests us." They taught that the signs would return someday, the restlessness, the pride, the hunger for more. But they also taught that if even one heart remembered how to listen, the earth would wait, and the balance could be saved. And so, in this new time, humanity did not see itself as master or victim, but as part of a great breathing story. They lived not to dominate, but to participate. They believed that the earth was not a place they lived on, but a being they lived within. They walked lightly, knowing that under every step lay memory of giants, of storms, of loss, of renewal. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the people gathered by their fires, as they always had. The flames danced softly, their light flickering on faces young and old. The elders spoke the same closing words every night: "We have walked this circle many times. Let us walk it wisely this time." And the children repeated the words, their voices small but sure, like the first notes of a song the earth herself might have written. The stars watched quietly above, shining on a world that had once been broken and had learned, once more, to heal. The rivers whispered, the trees swayed, and far below, in the heart of the earth, the deep, ancient pulse continued, steady, patient, forgiving, waiting for the next turn of the circle, the next lesson, and the next dream of those who still called her home. The years that followed this quiet balance were gentle and long. The world had grown wise again. People lived in small circles of peace, and the earth breathed softly under their feet. Children were born into calm villages where the days passed slowly and the nights were filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. The air was clear, and the rivers carried songs instead of sorrow. Yet, as always, time moved like a slow tide, washing away the sharp memories of the past until only the soft edges remained. The young ones grew curious again. They looked at the old carvings of spirals and asked, "Who made these? What do they mean?" The elders would tell them stories about the giants who once walked the land, the cities that rose and fell, and the long silence that followed. But the young could not imagine such things. The world they knew was simple, and the ruins seemed like the bones of a dream too large to be real. Still, something inside them stirred. They wanted to know more. In a small settlement by a wide plain, a group of wanderers began to dig near an old hill. They were not looking for treasure but for truth. For months, they uncovered broken stones, carved pieces of bone, and strange tools shaped from materials no one used anymore. The more they found, the more questions they had. Who made these? They asked. Were they like us, or something greater? The elders warned them not to disturb the ground too much, but curiosity is a quiet flame that does not easily fade. One day, a young woman named Lyra found a flat piece of stone covered in markings. The lines curved and twisted in patterns that looked like words. She brought it to her teacher, an old man named Roland, who had spent his life studying such symbols. He stared at the stone for a long time, tracing the lines with trembling fingers. "These," he said softly, "are not drawings. They are voices, carved in silence." Lyra frowned. "What do they say?" The old man smiled faintly. "That," he said, "is what we must learn again." And so began the great rediscovery. Villages sent their thinkers and their patient workers to study the old stones. They compared symbols, matched patterns, and listened to what the land seemed to whisper. The markings spoke of a time before time, when the earth was full of movement, when people lived among beasts as tall as trees, when knowledge grew faster than wisdom. Slowly, they began to read the forgotten language, not with perfect understanding, but with awe. What they learned changed them. The writings told of how the giants and the first people shared the same earth, how they lived in harmony until greed and pride broke the balance. It told of the storms, the fire, the long silence, and the rebirth that followed. The people realized that their own lives were part of the same endless circle: rise, fall, and return. It was not just a story, it was a mirror. The rediscovery spread from one valley to the next. Travelers carried copies of the symbols, carved into clay and bark. Every place they visited, people gathered to listen as readers spoke the words aloud. "We are the memory of the earth," they read. "We are her breath made flesh. When we forget her, she reminds us. When we listen, she forgives." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that filled hearts with quiet understanding. Artists began to carve the old language into their homes and tools. Potters inscribed it around the rims of their jars. Children learned to write their names beside the symbols for rain, wind, and soil. Even those who could not read felt the peace in the patterns. The earth seemed to hum again, pleased that her story was being told in the open air. But discovery is never without danger. Some began to dream too deeply about what else might lie hidden. If the old ones could carve words that lasted this long, said a builder named Care, perhaps they also knew how to control the earth itself. He and his followers began to dig not for memory, but for power. They sought the old chambers of metal and light described in half-broken inscriptions. The elders warned them, but the lure of ancient secrets was strong. "We will not make the same mistakes," Care promised. "We will use the old ways with care." But care fades quickly when ambition grows. They built their camp near a desert edge where the sand covered vast ruins. There, they found fragments of strange devices, thin plates that gleamed under the sun, rods that sang softly when struck, and hollow stones that carried echoes when the wind blew through them. They believed these were the tools of gods. They began to rebuild them, piece by piece, using what they had learned. When they placed the pieces together, something strange happened. At night, faint lights appeared over their camp, not from fire, but from the objects themselves. The people from nearby villages came to watch. Some fell to their knees, thinking the old world had returned. Others fled in fear. Care and his followers were proud. "We have brought the past to life," he said. "The earth remembers us, and now we will remember her power." But one evening, as the lights grew brighter, the wind changed. The air grew still, then heavy. The desert floor trembled. The glowing objects began to hum louder and louder until the sound was no longer beautiful but frightening. Animals ran from the plains, and the people covered their ears. The old stones cracked, releasing dust that smelled of age and lightning. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went dark. When the morning came, the camp was gone. The sand had swallowed it whole. Only a single carved stone remained, half buried, marked with a simple message, "We forgot again." News of this spread quickly. Some said it was the earth reclaiming her power. Others believed the old spirits had returned to guard their secrets. But most saw it as a warning, gentle, but clear. Knowledge, without listening, becomes the same as pride. The people mourned the lost builders and promised once more to remember the lesson. From then on, the study of the old words continued, but slowly, patiently. The readers taught that wisdom was not in the symbols themselves, but in the silence between them. "Listen to what they do not say," Roland told his students. "That is where truth hides." And Lyra, now grown wise and calm, added, "The past is not gone. It waits for us to be ready to understand it." Generations passed, and the world kept turning. The people no longer sought to rule the earth, but to read her. They saw history not as a line, but as a circle of light, fading, returning, and fading again. When storms came, they listened to them. When seasons shifted, they watched. The rediscovery did not lead to machines or empires. It led to balance. And yet, deep beneath the soil, the earth still held countless mysteries, chambers untouched, relics asleep, songs trapped in stone. The people knew they would find them one day, when the world was ready again. For now, they were content to live in peace, knowing that curiosity and care must walk hand in hand. At night, when the stars filled the sky, readers gathered children and told them the story of the spirals. They spoke of Sarah and her stone, of Mirren and Taro, of the rise and fall of giants, and of the quiet peace that followed. "We are the children of their dreams," they said. "And they are the memory of ours." The children listened with wide eyes, and though they could not imagine the giants or the glowing towers, they understood the heart of the story, that life is fragile, and love for the earth is the only strength that lasts. The people slept easily after such stories, their hearts light and their dreams calm. Somewhere deep in the earth, far below where roots could reach, the old relics of lost ages rested, quiet, patient, waiting. They had seen the circle many times before. They would see it again. And above them, on the green earth, humans walked softly through the grass, singing the same song they had once forgotten. The stars looked down and remembered too, shining their ancient light upon a world that had learned, once again, how to live and listen in peace. The wind moved softly across the sleeping plains, carrying the sound of leaves and distant water. The world had grown quiet again, not from emptiness but from understanding. The people had found their balance and learned how to live within it. Seasons came and went without rush or fear. The rivers flowed where they wished, and the forests thickened where they were left alone. For the first time in a very long time, the earth and her children seemed to breathe as one. In this age of calm, people no longer spoke of the rise and fall as separate things. They spoke of the turning, the endless circle that carried all life together. They knew that light would fade and return, that peace would rest and wake, that nothing truly ended. The stories of the giants and the old cities became gentle songs sung at dusk, not warnings, not pride, but reminders. Every child learned them before learning their own name, so that the memory of the earth would never sleep again. One evening, as the sky turned gold, a young boy named Iro sat with his grandmother by a river. She was old, with hands shaped by work and eyes as deep as the night. The boy asked, "Grandmother, will the giants ever come back?" She smiled softly, her face glowing in the fading light. "Perhaps they never left," she said. Maybe they walk in ways we cannot see, in the clouds, in the trees, in the strength we show when we care for one another. Iro looked out at the river, its surface shining like glass. But we are small, he whispered. How can the earth remember us? The old woman placed her hand on his chest. She remembers every heartbeat, she said. Each one is a drum in her song. The giants were big in body, but we are big in memory. Every time we love, every time we protect, the earth grows stronger through us. Her voice faded into the hum of crickets, and the boy felt something gentle move through him, as though the earth had whispered her own agreement. In the years that followed, Iro grew into a quiet man who listened to the wind as if it spoke directly to him. He built nothing grand, but everything he touched lasted. He planted trees along the rivers, not for shade but for the generations that would come. When people asked why he worked so patiently, he answered, "The giants once forgot the future. I will not." Others began to follow his example, building small gardens in the spaces between homes, planting where there was emptiness, giving life where silence lingered. Slowly, the world began to change again, not through destruction, but through growth. Forests stretched across old plains, and rivers found their ancient paths. The air carried the scent of flowers unseen for centuries. The earth seemed to hum louder now, her rhythm steady and calm. And in that harmony, people started to dream differently. Their dreams were no longer filled with fear or loss, but with connection. In sleep, they saw the giants walking beside them, not as gods or monsters, but as guides, reminding them that all life shares one breath. Scholars of the New World gathered to write down what the old ones had only spoken. They filled scrolls with stories of the turning, describing how the world had healed itself again and again. The earth does not end, one writer noted. She only transforms, teaching the same lesson in new ways. Others added drawings of spirals within circles, of hands touching soil, of rivers flowing through hearts. The language they used was simple, meant to be understood by anyone who could speak. There were no long words, no hidden meanings, only truth written in plain sound. Across the land, gatherings took place each season to celebrate balance. They called these nights the remembering. No one owned them, no one led them. People came together to sing, to tell stories, to thank the land. The fires burned low and steady, never high, and as the smoke rose, it carried the scent of herbs and rain. The song spoke of how the giants had walked before the first dawn, of how they fell, and of how their spirit returned through the people who learned to listen. Every song ended the same way: we are the breath that continues. Even the children began to see the world differently. When they picked fruit, they left the lowest branches untouched so the animals could eat. When they fetched water, they whispered to the river before taking it. They understood that living was a kind of conversation, one where giving and taking had to remain equal. And in that balance, joy grew naturally, like grass after rain. But the earth, in her endless wisdom, still carried mysteries that no one could explain. Sometimes strange lights appeared on the horizon, moving slowly across the night sky. They were not stars, nor fires, but something older, something that seemed to watch and remember. People did not fear them. They simply bowed their heads and said, "The earth remembers." Some believed the lights were the souls of the giants. Others thought they were the thoughts of the earth herself, drifting through the sky. Whatever they were, they reminded humanity that not everything needed to be understood to be loved. One morning, Iro, now an old man, walked to the river where he had once spoken with his grandmother. The air was cool, and mist floated over the water. He sat down and listened, just as he had as a boy. He could hear the hum of the earth beneath the flowing sound, deep, endless, kind. He closed his eyes and smiled. "We have done better this time," he whispered. "We remembered." The wind answered softly, brushing his face like a gentle hand. He felt peace, not as a thought, but as a warmth that filled his chest. When Iroh's people found him later, he was still sitting by the river, his head bowed and his expression calm. They did not weep. They lifted his body and placed it in the soil near the trees he had planted. Beside him, they placed a small spiral stone, the same kind Sarah once held generations ago. On it, they carved words that had become their promise. We listen. We learn. We return. Many years later, travelers came to that place and found the tree that had grown over Iroh's grave. Its roots spread wide, its branches reached high, and its leaves sang when the wind passed through them. They called it the Tree of Breath, for when one stood beneath it, the air seemed to move differently, as though it carried voices from the past. Some claimed to hear songs in its rustling, while others felt only stillness and calm. But all who stood there agreed on one thing: the earth was alive, and she remembered every kindness ever given to her. Time continued its long turning. Civilizations rose gently and faded softly, leaving behind not ruins, but gardens. The people who came after no longer saw themselves as rulers of the earth but as her caretakers. Their stories were shorter now, their wisdom simpler, but their peace was deeper. They had learned that greatness did not come from building high, but from listening low, to the soil, to the rain, to each other. And still, under mountains and seas, the remnants of the ancient ages slept. The giants of stone and memory remained buried in silence, their spirits awake but still. Perhaps they watched. Perhaps they dreamed. Perhaps they waited for the next turning of the circle, when new voices would rise to sing the old songs again. The stars moved slowly above, marking the passing of countless years. The earth spun beneath them, green and endless. In her quiet heart, the pulse continued, steady, forgiving, eternal. The story of giants, of rise and fall, of loss and renewal, became not a history but a rhythm, echoing in every river, every mountain, every living breath. And somewhere, beyond the reach of time, the giants smiled. They had never truly gone. They had become the earth herself, her strength, her patience, her grace. Their story was our story, and our story was hers. The circle had closed again, not with an ending, but with a beginning, one that would last as long as there was wind to move through trees, and hearts willing to listen to the green earth's song. The night settled softly across the world. The fires went out, and the people slept, their dreams full of rivers, stars, and the deep steady sound of a living planet. The earth turned beneath them, ancient and calm, carrying their stories like whispers across time. And in the hush between heartbeats, her voice could still be heard, quiet, loving, infinite, reminding them that as long as life remembered to listen, giants would always roam the green earth once more. The night deepened, and the stars spread like quiet fires across the sky. The world had found peace again, a circle complete yet still turning. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the voices of the past, the whispers of giants, the laughter of children, the songs of those who had learned to walk gently upon the green earth. Every sound was part of one great rhythm, an endless lullaby that the earth sang to those who listened. As the fire burned low, its light flickered over faces calm with thought. The people sat in silence, watching the glow dance across the soil that had once held their ancestors, their hopes, their mistakes. There was no sadness now, only quiet understanding. They knew that life was not a straight line but a circle, one that rose and fell, forgot and remembered, hurt and healed. And in that circle, everything found its place again. The rivers ran clear. The forests stood tall. The mountains slept under the same stars that had watched every age before. The giants, though unseen, still walked in spirit. Their heavy steps had become the heartbeat of the earth itself, slow and patient, steady as time. The people were no longer afraid of what came next, for they knew the song would never end, it would only change its tune. The storytellers looked into the fire and spoke softly to those gathered. We have followed the story of the giants from their rise to their fall, from their silence to their return. We have seen the earth remember and forgive. And now, as the circle closes once more, we know the truth that we are all part of the same breath, the same memory, the same dream. The people nodded, and some reached for each other's hands, feeling the warmth that passed between them like shared light. The wind shifted again, moving over the plains, whispering through the grass. It carried the faint echo of footsteps, slow, heavy, and distant, as if the giants still wandered, watching quietly, proud that their story lived on. The world slept under their care, and the night wrapped everything in peace. As the last embers of the fire faded to ash, the storyteller's voice softened. And so ends the journey of when giants roamed the green earth. But remember, endings are only pauses in the earth's great song. The story continues in every heart that listens, in every tree that grows, and in every breath that belongs to her. A long silence followed. The stars shimmered like old eyes full of memory. The earth exhaled, and the people closed their eyes, carried by the rhythm of her heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly, not as warning but as reminder the world was alive, and her story was far from over. What do you think about the mysteries of when giants roamed the green earth? Were the giants ever truly gone, or did they become part of the world that still lives and breathes beneath our feet? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this journey moved you, let your heart stay open to the stories still waiting in the quiet places of the world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sleepy Dungeons for more journeys through lost worlds and forgotten ages. Until next time, may your night be calm, your dreams deep, and your spirit at peace, carried softly on the breath of the green earth.